Random House Audiobooks presents Congo by Michael Crichton. Read for you by Judith Ivey.
Congo. Dawn came to the Congo rainforest. Pale sun burned away the clinging damp mist, revealing a gigantic, silent world, an alien place, inhospitable to man. Jan Kruger put aside his rifle and stretched. Dawn came quickly at the equator. Soon it was quite light. He glanced at the expedition campsite he had been guarding. 8 bright orange tents, a blue mess tent, a supply tarp lashed over boxed equipment. He saw the other guard, Misulu, sitting on a rock. Nearby was the transmitting equipment, a silver dish antenna, the black transmitter box, the coaxial cables running to the portable video camera. The Americans used this equipment to transmit daily reports by satellite to their home office in Houston. Kruger was the Bwana Makubwa, hired to take the expedition into the Congo. He had led expeditions before. Companies sending teams into the field wanted someone who knew local customs and dialects to arrange the travel. Kruger was well suited for this job. Kruger could not imagine why American geologists would want to go to the Virunga region of Zaire in the northeast corner of the Congo rainforest. Zaire was the richest country in Black Africa in minerals, but most were found in Shaba and Kasai, not in Virunga. Kruger knew better than to ask, and in any case, he had his answer soon enough. Once the expedition entered the rainforest, the geologists began scouring rivers and stream beds, looking for diamonds. But not just any diamonds. The geologists were after what they called Type 2B diamonds. Kruger gathered that it was the electrical properties of the diamonds that mattered. Certainly the samples were useless as gemstones. For 10 days, the expedition had moved along the western slopes of the Virunga volcanic chain. It was all going routinely until the porters flatly refused to proceed further. This part of Virunga, they said, was called the Place of Bones. The porters insisted that any men foolish enough to go further would have their bones broken, particularly their skulls. Kruger called for the head man. "What tribes are here?" Kruger asked, pointing to the jungle ahead. "No tribes," the headman said. "No men come here." "Then what crushes the skulls?" "Dawa," the headman said ominously, using the Bantu term for magical forces. "Strong dawa here." In the end, Kruger doubled their wages, and they agreed to continue. Even when they came upon several areas littered with shattered fragments of bone, Kruger was not concerned. He found the bones were not human, but rather the delicate bones of colobus monkeys. Nor was he any more impressed with the overgrown fragments of stone that suggested a city had once stood in the area. Kruger had come upon unexplored ruins before. He camped the first night near the ruins. The porters were panic-stricken, insisting that the evil forces would attack during the night. Their fear was caught by the geologists. To pacify them, Kruger had posted 2 guards that night, himself and Misulu. And just as he expected, the night had passed quietly. Around midnight, there had been some low wheezing sounds, which he took to be a leopard. Otherwise, it was quiet. And now, it was dawn. A soft beeping sound drew his attention. Misulu glanced questioningly at Kruger. On the transmitting equipment, a red light blinked. Kruger crouched over the black transmitter box with its rectangular green LED. Houston was asking for video camera transmission. He pressed the carrier button, and the screen blinked that a satellite transmission was being locked in. There would now be a 6-minute delay. He'd better go wake Driscoll, the head geologist, he thought. The colobus monkeys shrieked in the trees. Kruger glanced upward, wondering what had set them going. Something struck him lightly in the chest. At first he thought it was an insect, but a fleshy bit of red fruit rolled down his shirt to the ground. The damn monkeys were throwing berries. He bent over to pick it up, and then he realized that it was a human eyeball, slippery in his fingers. He looked over to where Miss Sulu was sitting. Miss Sulu was not there. Kruger moved across the campsite. Overhead, the colobus monkeys fell silent, and then he heard the wheezing sound again. It was an odd, soft sound, carried on the swirling morning mist. And he saw Miss Sulu on his back. His skull had been crushed from the sides, the one remaining eye wide and bulging. The other eye had exploded outward with the impact. Kruger felt his heart pounding. He heard the soft wheezing sound again. Then the colobus monkeys began their shrieking, and Kruger leapt to his feet and screamed. Day 1, Houston, June 13th, 1979. 10,000 miles away, in the main data room of Earth Resources Technology Services, Inc. of Houston, Karen Ross sat in front of a computer terminal reviewing the latest Landsat images from Africa. Ross was the ERT's Congo project supervisor, and as she manipulated the satellite images, she glanced at her watch impatiently. She was waiting for the next field transmission from Africa. It was now 10:15 p.m. Houston time. On the far wall, 8 large digital clocks recorded local time for the various field parties. The clock marked Congo Field Party read 6:15 a.m. when the overhead intercom said, "Dr. Ross, CCR bounce." She left the console after punching in the blocking codes. ERTS dealt in information, and as R.B. Travis, the head of ERTS, was fond of saying, the easiest way to obtain information was to steal it. She crossed the room with long strides. Ross was nearly 6 feet tall, an attractive though ungainly girl. Only 24, she was younger than most of the programmers, but she had a self-possession that most people found a little unsettling. Ross was a genuine mathematical prodigy. She entered MIT at 13 and proceeded to make a series of brilliant discoveries in abstract mathematics, which brought her to the attention of ERTS, where she was made the youngest field supervisor in the company. Not everyone liked her. The years of isolation, of being the youngest, had left her aloof and rather distant, and her youth still held her back. At least, age was Travis's excuse when he refused to let her lead the Congo expedition into the field. She had pressed him. Finally, he had said, "Look, Karen, that site's 10,000 miles away in 4+ terrain. We need more than a console hot dogger out there." She bridled under the implication that that was all she was, a console hot dogger, fast with the buttons. She wanted to prove herself in a 4+ field situation. Ross pressed the button for the third-floor elevator, marked CX Access Only. She was one of 8 people in the company who had access to the 3rd floor. She emerged into the communications control room, packed with electronic equipment. The CCR was the electronic nerve center of ERTS. All communications from field parties were routed through here. Everything in the CCR was recorded. One of the technicians said, "We'll have the transponders hooked in a minute." At 6:22 a.m. Congo time, the transmission came through. They were looking at the camp in the Congo, apparently a view from a tripod-mounted video camera. They saw 2 tents, a low, smoldering fire, the lingering wisps of a foggy dawn. There was no sign of activity. One of the technicians laughed. "We caught them still sleeping." "Lock your remote," Ross said. The technician punched in the remote override. The field camera came under their control. "Pan scan," she said. The video images shifted to the left, and they saw more of the camp. The camp was destroyed. Tents crushed and torn, supply tarp pulled away, equipment scattered. One tent burned brightly. They saw several dead bodies. "Jesus," one technician said. On the screens, the camera panned back across the camp. They saw no sign of life. Down pan, reverse sweep. On screen, the camera panned down. Nearby was another body, one of the geologists. "Jesus, that's Roger." "Zoom and T-lock," Ross said. The camera zoomed in on the face. What they saw was grotesque, the head crushed. "What did that?" At that moment, a shadow fell across the dead face on screen. Ross jumped forward, hitting the zoom control. The image widened swiftly. They could see the outline of a man, and he was moving. "Somebody's there! Somebody's still alive!" "He's limping, looks wounded." Ross stared at the shadow. It did not look to her like a limping man. Something was wrong. "He's going to walk in front of the lens," she said. "What's that audio static?" They were hearing an odd sound, like hissing or a sighing. "It's not static. It's in the transmission." "Resolve it," Ross said. The technicians punched buttons, but the sound remained indistinct, and then the man stepped in front of the lens. "Diopter," Ross said, but the face had already appeared, too close to focus without a diopter. They saw a blurred, dark shape, nothing more. Before they could click in the diopter, it was gone. "A native?" "This region of the Congo is uninhabited," Ross said. "Something inhabits it." "Pan scan," Ross said. "See if you can get him on screen again." The camera continued to pan. Then suddenly the image tilted and fell sideways. He knocked it over. "Damn!" The video image crackled, shifting lines of static. It became very difficult to see. "Resolve it! Resolve it!" They had a final glimpse of a large face and a dark hand as the silver dish antenna was smashed. The image from the Congo shrank to a spot and was gone. Earth Resources Technology Services generally had between 6 and 8 groups in the field at any time. Since their teams were often in hazardous or politically unstable regions, they were vigilant in watching for the first signs of interference signatures, a local uprising, a military coup, an earthquake. In the opinion of R.B. Travis, the videotapes from the Congo were the worst interference signature ever. But the signature origin remained mysterious. All they knew was that the camp had been destroyed in a mere 6 minutes, the time between the signal initiation from Houston and the reception in the Congo. Travis's first instruction was to figure out what the hell happened out there. A heavyset man of 48, Travis had managed to keep a sense of humor after a decade of high-tech problems, but he was not amused on June 13th. His entire expedition had been lost. 8 people. The worst disaster in Earth's history, and Earth's had no idea what had gone wrong. He called in the specialty teams of console hot doggers. "Everything we know from the Congo field expedition," he said, "is registered on that final videotape. I want a 7-band visual and audio salvage starting right now, because that tape is all we have." The specialty teams went to work. Ertz referred to the process as data recovery, or sometimes as data salvage. It was a slow and delicate process. One salvage crew immediately went to work on the audio recovery, another on the visual. Ross was already engaged in a visual recovery. Ertz had 837 computer programs to alter imagery, to enhance it, to eliminate unwanted elements, to bring out details. Ross used 14 programs on the Congo videotape. Suddenly, the image popped, coming up bright and clean. She caught her breath. The screen showed a dark, brooding face with heavy brows, watchful eyes, and a flattened nose. Frozen on the video screen was the face of a male gorilla. Travis came over, shaking his head.
We finished the audio recovery. The computer confirms it as human breathing, but from inhalation, not exhalation, the way people usually make sounds.
The computer is wrong, Ross said. It's not human. She pointed to the screen and the face of the gorilla. Travis showed no surprise.
Artifact, he said. The tag team's been screwing around again.
But this image is real, Ross insisted.
Gorillas don't behave that way. It's got to be an artifact.
Travis glanced at his watch.
Right now, the only question I have is how fast we can put a team back in the Congo.
Travis had never had any doubts about going back in. The only question was how best to do it. He called in all the section heads.
Travis began by saying, I want us back in the Congo in 96 hours.
By 11:45 p.m. on the night of June 13th, the main sequencing of the next expedition had been worked out and confirmed by the computer. A fully loaded 747 could leave Houston at 8 p.m. the following evening, June 14th. The plane could be in Africa on June 15th to pick up Monroe, or someone like him, and the full team could be in place in the Congo on June 17th. In 96 hours. Karen Ross could look into Travis's office and see the arguments taking place. Ross felt there was no point in going back until they knew what they were up against. She remained at her console, checking the image she had recovered. Ross ran 2 check programs against the gorilla image. The computer verified that the flat image was indeed 3-dimensional and coherent. This proved beyond a doubt that the image was real. She went to see Travis.
Let's say I buy this image, Travis said, frowning. I still don't see why you should take the expedition in.
Ross smiled. I know the database. The only hope you have is for the team leader to be fast on site. This time you need a console hot dogger in the field. Travis stared at her. She recognized that he was weakening. And I want to go outside, Ross said.
To an outside expert?
Yes, somebody on our grant list.
Risky, Travis said. You know the Euro-Japanese consortium is breathing down our necks.
It's important, Ross insisted. Travis sighed.
Okay, just don't delay your team.
Karen Ross was exhilarated by her new authority. She called up the grant lists on her office terminal. In the United States, there was only one gorilla researcher available, a primatologist named Dr. Peter Elliott at the University of California at Berkeley. The file on screen indicated that Elliott was 29 years old, unmarried, and associate professor in the Department of Zoology. Principal research interest was listed as primate communications, gorilla. Funding was made to something called Project Amy. She dialed the home number on the screen. Hello, a male voice said. Dr. Peter Elliott? Yes. This is Dr. Karen Ross in Houston. I'm associated with the Earth Resources Wildlife Fund, which supports your research. We're about to send an expedition into the Congo, and really, when are you going? The voice suddenly sounded excited, boyish. Well, we're leaving in 2 days, and I want to go, Elliott said. Ross hardly knew what to say. I'm planning to go there anyway, Elliott said, with Amy. Who's Amy? Amy is a gorilla, Peter Elliott said. Day 2, San Francisco, June 14th, 1979. Professor Elliott and his staff had decided on an African trip at least 2 days before Ross called him. His research had begun quietly, almost accidentally, when he read about a year-old gorilla who had been flown from the Minneapolis Zoo to the San Francisco School of Veterinary Medicine for treatment. That was in 1973. At his first visit to the hospital to meet Amy, he found a pathetic little creature with restraining straps on her frail black arms and legs. He stroked her head and said gently, "Hello, Amy. I'm Peter." Amy promptly bit his hand, drawing blood. From this inauspicious beginning emerged a singularly successful research program. In 1973, the basic teaching technique, called molding, was well understood. The animal was shown an object and the correct sign until the association was firmly made. But if the basic methodology was accepted, the application was highly competitive. Researchers competed over the rate of sign acquisition, or vocabulary. Elliot's diffident manner concealed a fierce ambition. Elliot intended to be the foremost ape researcher, and he intended Amy to be the foremost ape. Elliot's success in obtaining grants was such that by 1978, Project Amy had an annual budget of $160,000 and a staff of 8, including a child psychologist and a computer programmer. Elliot's difficulties began on February 2, 1979. Amy lived in a mobile home. She spent nights there alone and usually provided an effusive greeting the next day. However, that morning, the Project Amy staff found her in an uncharacteristic, sullen mood. Elliot felt that something had upset her during the night. When asked, she kept making signs for sleep box, a new word pairing. At first, they thought she might be referring to her nest-like bed. It turned out she was using box in her usual sense to refer to the television set. But Amy looked scornful as they examined the television in the trailer. She clearly meant something else. Finally, they determined that by sleep box she meant sleep pictures. When asked, Amy signed that they were bad pictures and old pictures, and that they make Amy cry. She was dreaming. The fact that Amy was the first primate to report dreams caused tremendous excitement among Elliot's staff. But Amy refused to discuss her dreams. Worse, her waking behavior deteriorated alarmingly. Temper tantrums occurred daily. Amy was 4.5 feet tall and weighed 130 pounds. She was immensely strong. The staff began to wonder if they could control her. Her refusal to talk about her dreams frustrated them. They tried a variety of investigative approaches. Finally, they hit on finger painting. This was immediately successful. Amy drew images swiftly and repetitively. The child psychologist noted that what Amy actually draws is a cluster of apparently related images, inverted crescent shapes or semicircles, which are always associated with an area of vertical green streaks. He cautioned against the obvious conclusion that she was drawing old buildings in the jungle. Amy is troubled by these pictures, and she's trying to banish them to paper. On June 11th, the Project Amy staff had a sudden, unexpected breakthrough in their understanding of Amy's dreams. Sarah Johnson, a research assistant, was checking prehistoric archaeological sites in the Congo on the unlikely chance that Amy might have seen such a site in her infancy. Johnson completed her research in a few hours, but she stayed on looking at other books, histories, early accounts. The earliest visitors to the Congo were Arab slave traders and Portuguese merchants. Because Johnson could read neither Arabic nor Portuguese, she just looked at the plates. And then she saw a picture that, she said, sent a chill up my spine. It was a Portuguese engraving originally dated 1642 and reprinted in an 1842 volume. Clearly visible was a ruined city in the jungle. The doors and windows were constructed with semicircular arches exactly as Amy had drawn them. It was, Elliot said later, the kind of opportunity that comes to a researcher once in his lifetime. The caption included a word that looked like zinj. We immediately hired translators. We had a chance to verify a major theoretical question. Amy's pictures seemed a clear case of specific genetic memory. Genetic memory theory proposed that genetic inheritance was not limited to physical traits alone. The question was whether higher animals had any part of their psychic apparatus fixed from birth by their genes. Now, Elliot felt, with Amy they had evidence for such a memory. Amy had been taken from Africa when she was only 7 months old. Unless she had seen this ruined city in her infancy, her dreams represented a specific genetic memory which could be verified by a trip to Africa. By the evening of June 11th, the Project Amy staff was agreed. They would take Amy back to Africa. But a trip to Africa would cost at least $30,000. And transporting a gorilla involved a bewildering tangle of bureaucratic red tape. Clearly, they needed expert help. And then, on June 13th, a Dr. Karen Ross called from Houston to say she was leading an expedition into the Congo in 2 days' time. When she asked if she could come to San Francisco, Dr. Elliot replied that he would be delighted to meet with her at her convenience. On June 14, 1979, Elliot entered his office shortly after 9. His secretary said, "Dr. Ross is on her way to San Francisco. Mr. Hakamichi called 3 times, says it's important. The Project Amy staff meeting is set for 10 o'clock, and Wendy is in your office." Really? James Weldon was a senior professor in the department. Windy Weldon was a master at knowing which way the wind was blowing. Elliot went into his office. Weldon was staring at the walls, which were covered with Amy's finger paintings. "She's still making these same pictures?" he asked finally. "Yes," Elliot said. "And you still have no idea what they mean?" "No idea," Elliot said. "Are you sure?" Weldon asked, frowning. "I think somebody knows." "Why is that?" Weldon said, "Someone has offered to buy Amy." "To buy her?" "A lawyer in Los Angeles called yesterday and offered to buy her for $150,000. "It must be some rich do-gooder," Elliot said, "trying to save Amy from torture." "I don't think so," Weldon said. "For one thing, the offer came from Japan. Someone named Hakamichi. He's in electronics in Tokyo. The lawyer called back this morning to increase his offer to $250,000. $250,000, Elliot said. For Amy? Of course it was out of the question. He would never sell her. But why would anyone offer so much money? Elliot discussed it at the Project Amy staff meeting at 10 o'clock. The only note of caution came from Bergman, the child psychologist. $250,000 is a lot of money, he said, and Mr. Hakamichi is probably no fool. If he's interested in her, I'd bet it's because of her drawings. But I can't imagine why those drawings would be worth $250,000. Neither could anyone else. The discussion turned to the drawings themselves and the newly translated texts. Sarah Johnson started out with the flat comment, "I have bad news about the Congo." For most of recorded history, she explained, nothing was known about the Congo. The Arabs came to East Africa in the 7th century A.D. in search of gold, ivory, spices, and slaves. They called the interior Zinj, the land of the blacks, a region of fable and fantasy. There were stories of vast forests and tiny men with tails, stories of mountains that spewed fire, stories of native villages overwhelmed by monkeys, stories of great giants with hairy bodies and flat noses, stories of native markets where the fattened carcasses of men were sold as a delicacy. Such stories were sufficiently forbidding to keep the Arabs on the coast, despite other stories equally alluring. Mountains of shimmering gold, riverbeds gleaming with diamonds, animals that spoke the language of men, great jungle civilizations of unimaginable splendor. In particular, one story was repeated again and again, the story of the lost city of Zinj, a source of inconceivable wealth in diamonds. The Arabs were told that the caravan route to the city had been jealously guarded for generation after generation. But the diamond mines were exhausted, and the city itself lay in crumbling ruins somewhere in Africa. This mysterious and alluring place the Arabs called the lost city of Zinj. Yet Johnson could find few detailed descriptions of the city. Then the Portuguese arrived. By 1544 they were venturing inland, but they never managed to penetrate the central Congo. But the early explorers repeated the legends of the interior, including the story of Zinj. A Portuguese artist, Juan Diego de Valdez, drew a picture of the lost city of Zinj in 1642. But, Sarah Johnson said, he also drew pictures of men with tails. Somebody groaned. Apparently Valdez was crippled, she continued. He lived all his life in Stubal, drinking with sailors and drawing pictures based on his conversations. Africa was not thoroughly explored until the mid-19th century. No trace of the lost city of Zinj was found. I told you it was bad news, Sarah Johnson said. You mean, Elliot said, that we don't know whether the city actually exists or not? Oh, it exists all right, she said. There's no doubt about that. Elliot glanced up quickly, and then he saw that Sarah Johnson had not answered him. A tall, gangly girl in her early 20s stood at the back of the room. She might have been considered beautiful except for her cold, aloof demeanor. She carried a briefcase, which she now set on the table, popping the latches. "I'm Dr. Ross," she announced, "from the Wildlife Fund, and I'd like your opinion of these pictures." She passed around a series of photographs, which were viewed by the staff with an assortment of whistles and sighs. They were grainy, black and white images, photographed off a video screen. But the image was unmistakable, a ruined city in the jungle with curious inverted, crescent-shaped doors and windows. "By satellite?" Elliot repeated. "That's right. The pictures were transmitted from Africa 2 days ago." "Then you know the location of this ruin?" "Of course." "And your expedition leaves in a matter of hours?" 6 hours and 23 minutes, to be exact," Ross said, glancing at her digital watch. Elliot talked privately with Ross for more than an hour. Elliot later claimed that Ross had deceived him about the purpose of the expedition. In any case, by midday on June 14th, Karen Ross found herself riding with Peter Elliot in his battered Fiat sedan. They were going to meet Amy. Elliot unlocked the door with its red sign, "Do not disturb, animal experimentation in progress." Behind the door, Amy was grunting and scratching impatiently. Elliot paused. "When you meet her," he said, "remember, she is a gorilla. Gorillas have their own etiquette. Don't speak loudly or make any sudden movements. If you smile, don't show your teeth, because bared teeth are a threat. If you talk to her, don't lie. She doesn't like it." "She doesn't like it?" "She dismisses you, won't talk to you, and gets bitchy." "Anything else?" "No, it should be okay," he smiled reassuringly. "We have this traditional greeting, though she's getting a little big for it." He opened the door, braced himself, and said, "Good morning, Amy." A huge black shape came leaping into his arms. Elliot staggered back under the impact. Ross was astonished. She had been imagining something smaller and cuter. Amy was as large as an adult human female. Amy kissed Elliot on the cheek with her large lips. Ross watched as he gently unwrapped her long arms from around his shoulders. "Amy happy this morning?" he asked. Amy's fingers moved quickly near her cheek, as if she were brushing away flies. "Yes, I was late today," Elliot said. She moved her fingers again, and Ross realized that Amy was signing. The speed was surprising. Inside the trailer, Elliot said, "Amy, this is Dr. Ross. Say hello." Amy looked at Karen Ross suspiciously. "Hello, Amy," Ross said. Amy stared at Ross, then walked to her easel. She had been finger painting and now resumed this activity. "What's that mean?" Ross said. She distinctly felt she was being snubbed. "We'll see," Elliot said. After a few moments, Amy ambled back. She went directly to Ross and deliberately streaked green finger paint on Ross's skirt. "I don't think this is going too well," Karen Ross said. Introducing new humans to Amy was difficult, particularly if they were women. Elliot had come to recognize many distinctly feminine traits in Amy. She preferred men to women, and she was openly jealous of Elliot's girlfriends. Amy signed, "No like woman, no like Amy, no like, go away, away." "Come on, Amy, be a good gorilla," Peter said. "What did she say?" Ross asked. "She said she likes your dress," he said. Amy shot him a look. "Amy not lie, Peter not lie." "Be nice, Amy," he said. "Karen is nice." Amy grunted and returned to her work, painting rapidly. "What happens now?" Ross said. "Give her time," he smiled reassuringly. At that moment, Amy ripped the paper from the easel and shredded it. She tore it angrily and signed, "This woman! This woman!" In symbolic terms, she was tearing Ross apart. And she was getting worked up. Amy would charge if he didn't interrupt. "Amy," he said sternly, "Karen Button woman." Amy stopped shredding. In her world, button was the term for a person of high status. Amy now stared at Button Ross with new respect. She went and stood in the corner, facing the wall. "What's that about?" Ross said. "She knows she's been bad." "She didn't mean any harm." She went over to Amy. Amy stared steadfastly at the corner. Ross unshouldered her purse and set it on the floor within Amy's reach. Peter said, "She'll wreck whatever's inside." "That's all right." Amy immediately dumped the contents on the floor. She began sifting through, signing, "Lipstick, lipstick, Amy like, Amy want, lipstick, want." "She wants lipstick." Ross found it for her. Amy smiled and grunted happily and crossed the room to her mirror. She applied lipstick. "I think we're doing better," Ross said. Across the room, Amy squatted by the mirror, happily making a mess of her face. It seemed a good time to ask her. "Amy want take trip?" Peter said. Amy loved trips. Lipstick and an offer of a trip was almost too much pleasure. She signed, "Car trip?" "No, not in the car. A long trip, many days." "Leave house?" "Yes, leave house, many days." This made her suspicious. She signed, "Where go trip?" "To the jungle, Amy." There was a long pause. Amy signed thoughtfully to herself, repetitively, as she did when she was mulling things over. Jungle, trip, trip, jungle. Go, trip, jungle, go. She set aside her lipstick. She stared at the bits of paper on the floor, and then she put them in the wastebasket. "What does that mean?" Ross asked. "That means Amy wants to take a trip," Peter Elliott said. The hinged nose of the Boeing 747 cargo jet lay open, exposing the cavernous, brightly lit interior. The plane had been flown up from Houston to San Francisco. It was now 9 o'clock at night, and puzzled workers were loading on the travel cage, a portable potty, and cartons of toys. Outside, Elliot stood with Amy. She signed to Peter, "Bird, noisy." "We fly bird, Amy," he said. Amy had never flown before. "We go car," she decided, looking at the plane. "We can't go by car. We fly." "Fly? Where fly?" Amy signed. "Fly jungle." He suggested they board the plane and look around. As they climbed the ramp, Amy signed, "Where button woman?" He was surprised to discover that Ross was already on board, talking on a telephone. She finished the call, turned to Elliot and Amy. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine. I'll show you around." She led him deeper into the cargo hold, with Amy at his side. "This," Karen Ross said, "is the main cargo hold." It was filled with clothing, equipment, food, all tagged with computer codes, all loaded in modules. Ross explained that ERTS could outfit expeditions in hours. She kept emphasizing the speed possible with computer assembly. "Why the rush?" Elliot asked. "It's business," Ross said. "Back in the 60s, a company might spend months investigating a possible site, but now the average ERTS contract runs under 3 weeks. As they continued the tour, Elliot noticed that much of the storage space was given to modules marked C3I. "That's right," Ross said. "Command, control, communications, and intelligence. They're micronic components. It's field communications, remote sensing, defense, and so on." She led them to the rear of the plane, where there was a modular living area with a large computer console and bunks. Amy signed, "Nice house." "Yes, it is nice." They were introduced to Jensen, a young bearded geologist, and to Irving Levine, who announced that he was the Triple E. "What's a Triple E?" Elliot asked. "Expedition electronic expert," Irving said cheerfully. "God knows what the Japanese and the Germans will throw at us." "Oh, damn, there she goes," Jensen said, laughing as Amy pushed the computer buttons. Elliot said, "Amy, no." "It's just a game," Jensen said, and he added, "She can't hurt anything." Amy signed, "Amy, good gorilla," and pushed the buttons again. She appeared relaxed, and Elliot was grateful for the distraction the computer provided. Ross brought them back to mundane matters. "Will Amy sleep on one of the bunks?" Elliot shook his head. "No, give her some blankets and she'll twist them into a nest on the floor." Ross nodded. "What about her vitamins and medications? Will she swallow pills?" "Ordinarily, you have to hide the pills in a piece of banana. She tends to gulp banana without chewing it." "Without chewing?" Ross nodded, as if that were important. "I'll see that she gets them. I have a new collar for her. Will she wear it?" "If you give it to her as a gift." As they reviewed Amy's requirements, Elliot realized that Amy's dream-driven neurotic behavior had fallen away. Perhaps, he thought, Amy just needed a little excitement. At 11 o'clock, the ERTS cargo plane taxied down the runway at San Francisco International, lifted ponderously into the air, and headed east toward Africa. Day 3, Tangier, June 15, 1979. Peter Elliott had known Amy since infancy. Now her behavior surprised him. Elliott had anticipated Amy would be terrified of the takeoff, but sedation proved unnecessary. Amy watched Jensen and Levine buckle their seatbelts, and she immediately buckled herself in, too. And although her eyes widened when she heard the full roar of the engines, the human beings did not seem disturbed, and Amy imitated their bored indifference. Once airborne, however, Amy looked out the window and immediately panicked. She scurried back and forth in whimpering terror while she signed, "Where? Ground! Ground! Where ground?" Elliott began grooming her, sitting her down and plucking at her hair. Grooming seemed to have a soothing, calming effect. Within minutes, Amy had relaxed enough to notice that the others were drinking, and she promptly demanded a green drop drink, her term for a martini with an olive, and a cigarette. She was allowed this on special occasions. Soon afterward, signing, "Amy, sleep now," she twisted the blankets into a nest on the floor and went to sleep, snoring loudly. Elliott had his own reaction to the journey. When he had first met Karen Ross, he assumed she was an academic like himself, but this enormous airplane filled with computerized equipment suggested a military association. Sitting at the computer console, Ross laughed. "We're much too organized to be military." She then told him the background of the Earth's interest in Virunga. Ross had also stumbled upon the legend of the lost city of Zinj, but she had drawn very different conclusions from the story. There had been no recent searches for Zinj. "So no one has ever found it?" Elliott said. "I think several expeditions of explorers found the ruined city," Ross said, "but nobody ever got back out again." Such an outcome was not necessarily mysterious. The early days of African exploration were incredibly hazardous. "I began," Ross said, "with the idea that the city existed after all. Assuming it existed, where would I find it?" The lost city of Zinj was associated with diamond mines, and diamonds were found with volcanoes. 3 volcanoes in the Virunga chain were active, thus Virunga seemed a good place to look. Her next step was to investigate the ground truth. "What's ground truth?" Elliott asked. "The experience of a team actually on the site. The preliminary expedition we sent in looking for gold found diamonds as well." She punched buttons on the console, and the screen images changed, glowing with flashing pinpoints of light. "You see, the deposits formed concentric semicircles leading back to the volcanoes. The diamonds were eroded from the slopes and washed down the streams to their present locations." "So you sent in a party to look for the source?" "Yes," she pointed to the screen, "but it's hard terrain, with visibility limited. An expedition could search for years and fail to see it, so I decided to see if I could find the city." "Find the city? From satellite pictures?" "Yes," she said, "and I found it." "So you sent an expedition in?" Elliott said. Ross nodded. 3 weeks ago. The expedition found the ruins of the city." "And then what happened?" Elliott asked. He ran the videotape a second time. On screen, he saw black and white images of the camp, destroyed, smoldering. Several dead bodies with crushed skulls were visible. As they watched, a shadow moved. Elliott agreed that it looked like the shadow of a gorilla, but he insisted gorillas couldn't do this. Gorillas are peaceful, vegetarian animals. Then they reviewed her final computer-reconstituted image, which clearly showed the head of a male gorilla. "That's ground truth," Ross said. Elliott was not so sure. The face and the fur were both unquestionably gray. "Can we increase contrast?" he asked Ross. "Gorillas are much darker." "Well, this contrast range is correct for video." Elliott was sure this creature was too light to be a mountain gorilla. Either they were seeing a new race of animal or a new species. A new species of great ape, gray in color, aggressive in behavior, discovered in the eastern Congo. He had come on this expedition to verify Amy's dreams, but now the stakes were suddenly much higher. In one corner of the 747 living module was a fiberglass booth with a hinged hood and a small CRT screen. As the airplane crossed the mid-Atlantic, Ross stepped inside it. Ross was tired, but she did not expect to get much sleep for the next 2 weeks, which was as long as she thought the expedition would last. Within 14 days, Ross's team would either have beaten the Euro-Japanese consortium, or she would have failed, and the Zaire-Virunga mineral exploration rights would be lost forever. The race was already underway, and Ross did not intend to lose it. She picked up the telephone receiver. "It's a bitch," Travis said. "Tell me," Ross said. "The competition is rolling." "Details," Ross said. "They know you're on your way. They're pushing their own schedule, and the Congo has gone to hell in the last 10 hours, Travis said. "We have a nasty GPU. "Print," she said. On the screen, she saw printed geopolitical update, followed by a dense paragraph. It read, Zaire Embassy, Washington, states eastern borders closed. Local tribes, Kijani, on rampage. Reported atrocities and cannibalism. Zaire government dispatched General Muguru to put down Kijani rebellion. Situation highly unstable. Acquisition White Hunter Monroe now paramount importance, whatever cost. Keep him from consortium. Your situation extreme danger. Must have Monroe to survive. She stared at the screen. It was the worst possible news. She said, "Have you got a time course?" The screen printed. Euro-Japanese consortium will enter Congo within 48 hours, now seeking Monroe. "When will they reach Tangier?" she asked. "In 6 hours. You?" 7 hours. And Monroe? "We don't know about Monroe," Travis said. "What about your passengers?" He was referring to Elliot and Amy. "They're fine," Ross said. "They know nothing." "Keep it that way," Travis said, and hung up. As Ross explained it, the GPU was just a technical report. The Zaire government had closed its eastern border. In Central Africa, local difficulties usually meant cannibalism and other atrocities. "Do you believe that?" Elliot asked. "Cannibalism and atrocities?" "No," Ross said. "It's all a lie. The Euro-Japanese Electronics Consortium knows that ERTS is close to discovering important diamond reserves in Virunga. They want to slow us down. They've got the fix in somewhere and close the eastern border. It's nothing more than that." "If there's no danger, why have we got machine guns on board?" "Just precautions," she said. "Now why don't you get some sleep? We'll be landing in Tangier soon." "Tangier? Captain Monroe is there." Captain Charles Monroe was not employed by any of the usual field parties. There were several reasons for this, foremost among them his distinctly unsavory reputation. Monroe had been raised in Kenya, the illegitimate son of a Scottish farmer. Monroe's activities ultimately forced him to disappear from East Africa in late 1963. He appeared again in 1964 as one of General Mobutu's white mercenaries in the Congo. Following the capture of Stanleyville, Monroe again disappeared. In 1968, he re-emerged in Tangier, where he lived splendidly. Foreign mining and exploration companies were reluctant to hire Monroe, as he was by far the most expensive of the bush guides. Nevertheless, he had a reputation for getting tough, difficult jobs done. That was why the ERTS jet stopped in Tangier. At the Tangier airport, all ongoing personnel except Amy passed through customs. Jensen and Levine were pulled aside for searches. Trace quantities of heroin were discovered in their hand baggage. Both vigorously denied any knowledge of illicit material and appealed to the local U.S. consular office. But the case could not be resolved for several days. Ross telephoned Travis, who determined that it was a plant. There was nothing to be done except to continue as best they could. "They think this'll stop us," Travis said, "but it won't." "Who's going to do the geology?" Ross asked. "You are," Travis said. "And the electronics?" "You're the certified genius," Travis said. "Just make sure you have Monroe. He's the key to everything." Karen Ross sat on the terrace of Captain Monroe's house and waited for her audience with the man himself. Beside her, Elliot snored noisily. They had been waiting nearly 3 hours, and she was worried. From the interior, she could hear voices. One of the servant girls came onto the terrace carrying a telephone. In careful English, the girl said, "This is your telephone to Houston. The bidding will now begin." Karen nudged Peter, who awoke groggily. "The bidding will now begin," she said. Elliot was surprised from the moment of his entrance into Monroe's house. He had anticipated a tough military setting and was amazed to see delicate carved Moroccan arches and soft, gurgling fountains. Then he saw the Japanese and Germans in the next room staring at him and at Ross. The glances were distinctly unfriendly. Captain Monroe appeared in the next room wearing khakis, smoking a cigar. He was a tall, rugged-looking man with a mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He talked with the Japanese and Germans, who were evidently unhappy. Moments later, Monroe entered their room, smiling broadly.
"So, you're going to the Congo, Dr. Ross?"
"We are, Captain Monroe," she said. Monroe smiled.
"It seems as though everyone is going."
There followed a rapid exchange which Elliot found incomprehensible. Karen Ross said 50,000 U.S. in Swiss francs against .02 of first-year adjusted extraction returns. Monroe shook his head.
100 in Swiss francs and .06 of first-year return on the primary deposits. Crude grade accounting, no discounting. I am no gambler.
"If you're no gambler, I'll give you a straight buyout for 200. Monroe shook his head. He headed back into the other room where the Japanese and Germans were waiting. Ross talked in low tones on the telephone. "He'll never accept that. They want him bad." Elliot said, "You're bidding very high for his services." "He's the best," Ross said, and continued whispering into the telephone. In the next room, Monroe was shaking his head sadly, turning down an offer. Monroe came back to Ross.
"You're foolish to spend all this money to go to the Congo," Monroe said. "Aren't you?"
Ross made no reply.
"Virunga's not exactly a garden spot these days," Monroe continued. "The Kijani are on the rampage, and they're cannibals. Perhaps you should put off your trip."
Those were precisely Elliot's sentiments, and he said so.
"Wise man,"
Monroe said. "Evidently," Ross said, "we will never come to terms."
"That seems clear,"
Monroe nodded. Elliot understood that negotiations were broken off, but Monroe walked into the next room and conferred with the Japanese and Germans. "Things are looking up," Ross said. "Why?" Elliot said. "Because he thinks we know more than they do and are more likely to pay off." In the next room, the Japanese and Germans abruptly stood and walked to the front door. "I guess you're right," Elliot said to Ross. "He's sending them away." They ate Moroccan style, sitting on the floor and eating with their fingers. The first course was a pigeon pie, followed by some sort of stew. "So you sent the Japanese off," Ross said. "Told them no?"
"Oh, no," Monroe said. "I told them I would think about it, and I will."
"Then why did they leave?" Monroe shrugged. Ross glanced at her watch. "Very good stew," she said, doing her best to be agreeable.
"Glad you like it. It's camel meat."
Ross coughed. Elliot noticed that his own appetite had diminished. Monroe turned to him.
"So you have the gorilla, Professor Elliot."
"How did you know that?"
"The Japanese told me. Japanese can't figure the point of it. Drives them mad. The young man with a gorilla. The young woman who is searching for
industrial-grade diamonds," Ross said. "You've got to take us in, Monroe."
"World's full of industrial-grade diamonds," Monroe said. "But you're going to the Congo."
The obvious question hung in the air. "We are looking for type 2B boron-coated blue diamonds," Ross said, "which have semiconducting properties important to microelectronics applications." Monroe stroked his mustache.
"Blue diamonds," he said,
nodding. He crossed the room and looked out on the dark Tangier night.
"I'm not surprised," he said. "As a matter of—"
At the first blast of machine gun fire, Monroe dived for cover, and Elliot and Ross threw themselves to the marble floor as the bullets whined around them. The blast lasted 30 seconds or so. When it was over, they got up hesitantly, staring at one another.
"The consortium plays for keeps,"
Monroe grinned.
"Just my sort of people."
Ross brushed off her clothes. She turned to Monroe. 5.2 against the first 200, no deductions in Swiss francs, adjusted.
5.7, and you have me.
5.7, done. Monroe shook hands with them. An hour later, they were airborne, heading toward Nairobi. Day 4, Nairobi, June 16, 1979. From Tangier to Nairobi, it was 3,600 miles, an 8-hour flight. Ross spent the time at the computer console. The screen showed a computer-generated map of Africa with streaking multicolored lines across it. "These are all timelines," Ross said. Beneath the screen was a total elapsed time clock, which kept shifting numbers. "What's that mean?" Elliot asked. "The computer's picking the fastest route. It's just identified a timeline that will get us on site in 6 days, 18 hours, and 51 minutes. Now it's trying to beat that time." Elliot had to smile. The idea of a computer predicting to the minute when they would reach their Congo location seemed ludicrous, but Ross was totally serious. As they watched, the computer clock shifted to 5 days, 22 hours, 24 minutes. "Better," Ross said, nodding, "but still not very good." She pressed another button, and the line shifted, stretching over the African continent. "This is the consortium route," she said. "They're going in big, 30 or more people. They don't know the exact location of the city, but they have a substantial start on us, at least 12 hours, since their aircraft is already forming up in Nairobi." She pressed a button marked Date. "According to this, the consortium will reach the Congo site a little after 8 o'clock in the morning on June 21st. The computer clicked quietly. The lines continued to stretch and pull. "Well," she said, "given maximum favorable movements, the consortium will beat us by more than 4 hours, 5 days from now." "But surely," Elliot said, "you can't put too much faith in those figures." "At most, the computer is off by minutes." Ross shook her head. "No, we have a problem here, and we've got to do something. The stakes are too great." "You mean the diamonds?" She nodded and pointed to the bottom of the screen where the words "Blue Contract" appeared. He asked her what the blue contract was. "One hell of a lot of money," Ross said. And she added, "I think." For in truth, she did not really know. Each new contract at Ertz was given a code name. Only Travis knew the name of the company buying the contract. Travis had said that the blue contract was the biggest thing we'll see in the next 10 years. Whoever finds those diamonds has a jump on the technology for at least 5 years. That's an advantage measured in billions of dollars, maybe tens of billions, if we can get to those diamonds. These were the reasons for the extraordinary pressure Ross felt. At 24, she was team leader in a high-technology race involving a half-dozen nations. The stakes made any conventional race seem ludicrous. Travis told her before she left, "Don't be afraid when the pressure makes you crazy. Just do the best you can." She managed to reduce the expedition timeline by another 3 hours and 37 minutes, but they were still slightly behind the consortium projection. Not too far to make up the time, but nevertheless behind, which could mean disaster in a winner-take-all race. The pilot clicked on the intercom. "We are beginning our descent into Nairobi," he said. The Ertz cargo plane landed at Nairobi International Airport at dawn on June 16th, and Monroe contacted porters and assistants for the expedition. They intended to leave within 2 hours, until Travis called to inform them that Peterson, one of the geologists on the first expedition, had somehow made it back to Nairobi. Ross was excited by the news. "Where is he now?" she asked. "At the morgue," Travis said. Elliot winced as he came close. The body on the stainless steel table was his own age. The man's arms had been crushed. The skin was a ghastly purple. He glanced at Ross. She seemed perfectly cool. The pathologist turned to Ross. "When was the last time you saw Mr. Peterson?" "In May. He was leaving for the Congo." "What happened?" "Damn strange story," the pathologist said. The previous day, June 15th, Peterson had been flown to Nairobi aboard a small charter plane in end-stage terminal shock. He died several hours later without regaining consciousness. "Extraordinary he made it at all. Apparently, the aircraft made an unscheduled stop in Zaire, and then this fella come stumbling out of the woods, collapsing at their feet." The pathologist pointed out that the bones had been shattered in both arms. Elliot said, "What could cause that injury?" "Superficially, it resembles a crush injury from an automobile or truck, but mechanical crush injuries are never bilateral, as they are in this case." "So it wasn't a mechanical injury?" Ross asked. "Don't know. It's unique in my experience," the pathologist said briskly. "We also found traces of blood under his nails and a few strands of grey hair. We're running a test now." Across the room, another pathologist looked up from his microscope. "The hair is definitely not human. Some kind of animal hair, close to human." A large stainless steel analyzer began pinging. "Blood's coming through," pathologist said. On the screen, the computer printed alpha and beta serum globulins match. Gorilla blood. "She won't hurt you," Elliot told the frightened orderly. They were in the passenger compartment of the 747. "See? She's smiling at you." Amy was indeed giving her most winning smile, being careful not to expose her teeth. But the orderly from the private clinic in Nairobi was not familiar with gorilla etiquette. His hands shook as he held the syringe. Nairobi was the last opportunity for Amy to receive a checkup. Amy took it all in stride, but the terrified orderly did not know that. He approached her holding the syringe like a weapon. "You sure he won't bite?" Amy, trying to be helpful, signed, "Amy promises no bite." "She promises not to bite you," Elliot said. "So you say," the orderly said. After the blood samples were drawn, the orderly relaxed a little. Packing up, he said, "Certainly is an ugly brute." "You've hurt her feelings," Elliot said. And indeed, Amy was signing. "What ugly?" "Nothing, Amy," Elliot said. "He's just never seen a gorilla before." The orderly said, "I beg your pardon?" "You've hurt her feelings. You'd better apologize." The orderly stared at Elliot and then at Amy. "Apologize to him?" "Her," Elliot said. "Yes. How would you like to be told you're ugly?" The orderly frowned. "You mean that he understands English?" "Yes, she does." The orderly shook his head. "I don't believe it." "Amy, show the man to the door." Amy lumbered over to the door and opened it for the orderly, whose eyes widened as he left. Amy closed the door. "Silly human man," Amy sighed. "Never mind," Elliot said. "Come. Beat her tickle, Amy." And for the next 15 minutes he tickled her as she rolled on the floor and grunted. Elliot never noticed the door open behind him, never noticed the shadow falling across the floor, until it was too late. His head erupted with blinding white pain, and everything went black. He awoke to a piercing electronic shriek. "Don't move, sir," a voice said. Elliot opened his eyes and stared into a bright light shining down on him. He was lying on his back in the aircraft. Someone was bent over him. "Look to the right. Now to the left. Can you flex your fingers?" He followed the instructions. The light was taken away, and he saw a black man in a white suit crouched beside him. The man touched Elliot's head. His fingers came away red with blood. "Nothing to be alarmed about," the man said. "It's quite superficial." He looked off. "How long would you estimate he was unconscious?" "Couple of minutes, no more," Monroe said. The high-pitched squeal came again. Elliot saw Ross moving around, wearing a shoulder pack and holding a wand in front of her. There was another squeal. "Damn," she said, and plucked something from the window. "That's 5. They really did a job." Monroe looked down at Elliot. "How do you feel?" he asked. Elliot said, "Where is she?" "They took her," Monroe said. "We found this next to you." Monroe gave him a small glass vial. At one end was a rubber plunger, at the other end a broken needle. Elliot turned the vial over. "There was frost on it?" Monroe nodded. "Very cold." CO2, Elliot said. It was a dart from a gas gun. They broke the needle off in her. He sniffed the vial. Labaxin, fast-acting soporific. It's what they'd use. Elliot got to his feet and leaned on Monroe. The doctor protested. "I'm fine," Elliot said. Across the room there was another squeal. Ross removed a small black device from one seat. "Look at this. They must have brought an extra person just to plant the bugs. It'll take hours to sterilize the plane. We can't wait." Elliot said, "Where are they now?" "The consortium." "The main party left Nairobi 6 hours ago," Monroe said. "Then they didn't take Amy with them." "Of course they didn't take her," Ross said, sounding annoyed. "They've got no use for her. They're just trying to blow our timeline, but they won't succeed." Something in her tone suggested that she planned to leave Amy behind. The idea appalled Elliot. 72 minutes, Ross said, before we blow the timeline. She turned to Monroe, "And we have to switch over to the second contingency." "Fine," Monroe said. "I'll get the men working on it." "In a new plane," Ross said. "We can't take this one. It's contaminated." Elliot said, "I won't leave Amy. If you're going to leave her behind, you'll have to leave me as well." "Let me tell you something," Ross said.
I never believed that Amy was important to this expedition, or you either. When I came to San Francisco, I was followed. You and Amy provided a diversion. You threw the consortium into a spin. It was worth it. Now it's not. We'll leave you both behind if we have to. I couldn't care less. Well, God damn it, Elliot began. Do you mean to tell me that... That's right, Ross said coldly. You're expendable. But even as she spoke, she led him out of the airplane while she held her fingers to her lips. Elliot realized that she intended to pacify him in private. Amy was his responsibility, and to hell with all the diamonds and international intrigue. Outside, he repeated stubbornly, I'm not leaving without Amy. Neither am I. Ross walked quickly toward a police helicopter. Elliot hurried to catch up. What? Don't you understand anything? Ross said. That airplane's not clean. It's full of bugs, and the consortium's listening in. I made that speech for their benefit. But who was following you in San Francisco? Nobody. They're going to spend hours trying to figure out who was. Amy and I weren't just a diversion? Not at all, she said. Look, we don't know what happened to the last Ertz Congo team, but I think guerrillas were involved, and that Amy will help us when we get there. As an ambassador? We need information, Ross said, and she knows more about guerrillas than we do. But can you find her in an hour and 10 minutes? Hell no, Ross said, checking her watch. This won't take more than 20 minutes. Lower! Lower! Ross was shouting into her radio headset as she sat alongside the police helicopter pilot. She was looking at a box on her knees with 4 compass point digital readouts. She flicked switches quickly. East now, due east, she instructed, and the helicopter moved east. Elliot felt his stomach twist. He felt awful, but he had insisted on coming. Now Ross pointed to the northeast. Slower now, slower. The readouts glowed, the numbers shifting. Elliot saw them all go down to 0 simultaneously. Down! Ross shouted, and the helicopter descended in a vast garbage dump. The pilot remained with the helicopter. His final words were disquieting. Where there's garbage, there's rats, he said. Rats don't bother me, Ross said, climbing out. Where there's rats, there's cobras, the pilot said. Oh, Ross said. She crossed the dump with Elliot. Not far now, Ross said, watching the box. She was excited, glancing at her watch. Here? She bent over and picked through the trash. Finally, she came up with a necklace she had given Amy. Hell, Ross said, 16 minutes shot, and she hurried back to the waiting helicopter. Elliot fell into step behind her. But how can you find her if they got rid of her necklace bug? Nobody, Ross said, plants only one bug. This was just a decoy. Maybe they got rid of the second bug, too, Elliot said. They didn't, Ross said. The helicopter lifted off. She said to the pilot, Take me to the largest scrap metal source in Nairobi. Within 9 minutes, they had picked up another very weak signal, located within an automobile junkyard. The helicopter landed in the street outside. Ross went with Elliot into the junkyard, moving past the rusting hulks of cars and trucks. You're sure she's here? Elliot said. No question. They have to surround her with metal. Why? Shielding. She picked her way around, pausing frequently to refer to her electronic box. Then Elliot heard a grunt. It came from inside an ancient bus. Elliot climbed through the shattered doors. He found Amy on her back, tied with adhesive tape. He tore the tape off. He located the broken needle and plucked it out. Amy shrieked, then hugged him. It's all right, Amy, it's all right, he said. He examined her. She seemed okay. And then he said, Where's the second bug? Ross grinned. She swallowed it. Elliot felt a wave of anger. You made her swallow it? An electronic bug? Do you realize her health is extremely precarious? Don't get worked up, Ross said. Remember the vitamins I gave you? You swallowed one, too. She glanced at her watch. 32 minutes, she said. Not bad at all. Monroe sat in the 747 punching buttons on the computer. He watched as the lines crisscrossed over the maps. The computer ran through possible expedition routines quickly, testing a new one every 10 seconds, looking for a solution. He had to find a faster timeline to get them in. Monroe pressed the buttons, watching the data flash up. He began to eliminate alternatives. The computer kept coming back with reduced times, but always too long. The best projection beat the consortium by 37 minutes, which was nothing to rely on. He frowned. Were there other, unorthodox approaches they had overlooked? And then he had an idea. The others wouldn't like it, but it might work. Monroe called up the logistics equipment list. Yes,
They were equipped for it. He punched in the routing, smiling as he saw the line streak straight across Africa. He called for outcomes. Proposed routing unacceptable. He pressed the override button, got the data outcomes anyway. It was just as he thought. They could beat the consortium by 40 hours, nearly 2 full days. The computer went back to the previous statement. Proposed routing unacceptable. Altitude factors. Hazards to personnel excessive. Probability success under limits. Monroe didn't think that was true. He thought they could pull it off. In fact, the more Monroe thought about it, the more certain he was that it would work. The little Fokker S-144 prop plane was pulled up alongside the giant 747 cargo jet. Men transferred equipment from the larger plane to the smaller one. Ross explained to Elliot that they would be taking the smaller plane since the 747 had to be debugged. "But the jet must be faster," Elliot said. "Not necessarily," Ross said, but she did not explain further. In any case, Elliot had other concerns. He helped Amy aboard. She seemed to be bruised all over, but she was in good spirits. Soon she fell asleep. Elliot moved toward the rear of the plane, where Ross was talking with a jolly black man, whom she introduced as Cahiga. "Ah," Cahiga said, shaking Elliot's hand. "Dr. Elliot. Dr. Ross and Dr. Elliot, 2 doctors. Very good cover. We take what, M16s? Very good rifle. I prefer it myself." Then he went off. "You sure we aren't running guns?" Elliot asked. "We're after something more valuable," Ross said. She was repacking the equipment. Elliot asked if he could help, but she shook her head. "I've got to do this myself. We have to get it down to 40 pounds per person." 40 pounds? For everything? That's what the computer projection allows. Monroe's brought in Cahiga and 7 other Kikuya assistants. That makes 11 people altogether, plus Amy. She gets her full 40 pounds. The news gave Elliot serious misgivings. His immediate desire to back out was checked by his memory of the gray gorilla-like creature that he suspected was a new, unknown animal. That was a discovery worth risk. The Fokker lifted off from the Nairobi runway at 14:24 hours, 3 minutes ahead of their new timeline schedule. The Fokker stopped to refuel at Rawamagina Airport in Rwanda. The local traffic control officer boarded the plane with a clipboard and forms, asking their next destination. Monroe said it was Rawamagina Airport, meaning that the aircraft would make a loop, then return. Elliot frowned. "But we're going to land somewhere in the—" "Shh," Ross said. "Leave it alone." Certainly the traffic officer seemed content with this flight plan. Once the pilot signed the clipboard, he departed. Ross explained to Elliot that most outlying African airfields were just dirt strips cut into the bush. Elliot accepted her explanation and went back to check on Amy. Ross sighed. "Don't you think we better tail him?" she asked. "There's no point in upsetting him until we have to," Monroe said. "After all, what's this worth to us? 40 hours at least. We could still beat them." "Well, there's your answer," Monroe said. "Now keep your mouth shut. Get some rest." Day 5, Moruti, June 17, 1979. 5 hours out of Rawamagina, the landscape changed. Near the Zaire border, they found themselves flying over the Congo rainforest. Elliot knew that the forest extended west for nearly 2,000 miles, until it stopped at the Atlantic Ocean on the west coast of Zaire. Elliot had been anticipating Amy's reaction to this first view of the jungle. She looked out the window with a fixed stare. She signed, "Here, jungle." She was identifying the jungle, but he sensed no deeper recognition. Elliot said to her, "Amy like jungle?" "Jungle here," she signed. "Jungle is." Elliot watched her cup her chin on her hand as she stared lazily out the window. She signed, "Amy want cigarette." She had noticed Monroe smoking. "Later, Amy," Elliot said. The airplane flew east toward a wooded highland area, and then Elliot heard the first explosion, and the Fokker shuddered. Running to the window, he saw a straight, thin, white vapor trail off to their right. The Fokker was banking, tilting toward the jungle. As he watched, a second trail streaked up toward them. It was a missile, he realized, a guided missile. There was a bursting red explosion. The airplane shook, Elliot couldn't believe it. Someone was shooting missiles at them. "What the hell's happening?" Elliot said. "Who's shooting at us?"
"Probably the FZA," Monroe said. "The Zaire Army."
"The Zaire Army? Why?" "It's a mistake," Ross said, still punching computer buttons, not looking up. "A mistake? They're shooting surface-to-air missiles at us, and it's a mistake? Don't you think we'd better tell them?" "Can't," Ross said. "Why not?"
"Because," Monroe said, "we didn't file a flight plan in Rawamagina. That means we are technically in violation of Zaire airspace."
Elliot said, "When I agreed to join this expedition, I didn't expect to get into a war." "Neither did I," Ross said. Monroe took him aside.
"It's going to be all right," he told Elliot. "They're outdated 60 SAMs. We're in no danger. Just look after Amy. Let me work with Ross."
Ross was under intense pressure. She had to make a decision quickly. She had just been dealt a devastating setback. The Euro-Japanese consortium had been ahead of them from the very start by approximately 18 hours. In Nairobi, Monroe had worked out a plan with Ross which would put the Earth's expedition on site 40 hours ahead of the consortium. But that was before the Zaire Army SAMs began exploding all around them. They were still 80 miles south of their destination, circling over Kijani territory. It looked as if their daring plan was suddenly irrelevant. And to add to her difficulties, she could not confer with Houston. The computer refused to link up. She finally realized that her transmission was being jammed. For the first time in her memory, Karen Ross wanted to cry.
"Easy now,"
Monroe said quietly.
"One thing at a time. You didn't expect the consortium to sit by idly. Have you got countermeasures?"
"Sure, I've got countermeasures," Ross said, "but we need information now. Our plan is shot."
"One thing at a time,"
Monroe repeated. He knew she was not thinking clearly.
"Shall I tell the others?"
he asked. "Yes," Ross said. They heard another rocket explosion. "Let's get out of here." Monroe moved swiftly to the rear of the Fokker and said to Cahiga,
"Prepare the men."
"Yes, boss," Cahiga said. A bottle of whiskey was passed around, and each of the men took a long swallow. Elliot said, "What the hell is this?"
"The men are getting prepared,"
Monroe said. "Prepared for what?" Elliot asked. At that moment, Ross came back, looking grim. "From here on, we'll continue on foot," she said. Elliot looked out the window. "Is the plane going to put down in the fields?" Elliot asked. "No," Ross said. "The plane is not going to put down at all." "Then how do we get down?" Elliot asked.
"Amy will be fine,"
Monroe said cheerfully, cinching Elliot's straps tightly around his chest.
"I gave her a shot of your thoraline tranquilizer. I'll keep a good grip on her."
"Keep a good grip on her?" Elliot asked. Monroe said,
"I'll have to carry her down."
Amy lay limply on her back, snoring.
"Now then,"
Monroe said.
"Your parafoil opens automatically. If anything goes wrong, your reserve chute is here, on your chest. Nothing to worry about. The whole thing's automatic."
Elliot was chilled, drenched in sweat. "What about landing?"
"Nothing to it,"
Monroe grinned.
"You'll land automatically. Stay loose and relax."
Behind him, Elliot saw the open door, bright sunlight glaring into the plane. Cahiga's men jumped in quick succession. He glanced at Ross, who was ashen as she gripped the doorway. "Karen, you're not going to go along with—" She jumped, disappearing into the sunlight. Monroe said,
"You're next."
"I've never jumped before," Elliot said.
"That's the best way. You won't be frightened."
"But I am frightened."
"I can help you with that,"
Monroe said, and he pushed Elliot out of the plane. Elliot fell, scared to death. His stomach jumped into his throat, and his body rushed sickeningly downward. Nothing was happening. It had been at least 3 minutes since he jumped from the plane. He dared not open his eyes for fear of seeing the trees rushing up close as his body crashed downward toward them in his final seconds of conscious life. He snapped upright with a bone-twisting jolt. For an instant he thought he had hit the ground, and then he realized that he was descending, but more slowly. Looking up, he could not see the plane. Directly overhead was a giant rectangular shape, the parafoil. It looked very much like an airplane wing, with cords running down to his body. He took a deep breath and looked down. He could see the other parafoils below, Cahiga and his men, and Ross. He looked up, hoping to see Monroe, but all he could see was his own parafoil. It wouldn't be long before he landed. The trees could not be avoided. The branches seemed to reach up like fingers, grasping for him. He closed his eyes. Any second he was going to hit the ground and roll. He never hit. Everything became silent. He felt himself bobbing up and down. He opened his eyes and saw that he was swinging 4 feet above the ground. His parafoil had caught in the trees. He fumbled with the harness buckles and fell out onto the earth. As he picked himself up, Cahiga and Ross came running over to ask if he was all right. "I'm fine," Elliot said. The next instant he fell over and promptly threw up. Cahiga laughed. "Welcome to the Congo," he said. Elliot wiped his chin and said, "Where is Amy?" A moment later, Monroe landed with Amy. Amy was none the worse for the experience and came running over to Elliot, signing, "Amy, fly! No, like!" 20 minutes later, they were moving single file through the forest, starting a trek that would lead them into the unexplored eastern reaches of the Congo to a fabulous reward, if they could reach it in time. Elliot enjoyed the walk through the Barawana forest. Monkeys chattered in the trees and birds called in the cool air.
"Enjoy the forest,"
Monroe advised him.
"This is the last time you'll feel cool and dry for quite a while."
Elliot agreed that the forest was pleasant.
"Yes, very pleasant."
Monroe nodded, with an odd expression on his face. The Barawana forest was not virginal. From time to time they passed cleared fields, although they never saw farmers. When Elliot mentioned that fact, Monroe just shook his head, unwilling to talk. Shortly after 1 o'clock, they heard the thumping of helicopters. They waited, looking upwards. Moments later, 2 large helicopters passed overhead. Elliot clearly read white stenciling, FZA. Monroe squinted at the departing craft.
"It's the army," he said. "They're looking for Kijani."
An hour later they arrived at a clearing. A crude wooden farmhouse stood in the center with pale smoke issuing from a chimney. But they saw no inhabitants. Monroe raised his hand to call for a halt. The porters sat in the grass, not speaking. The atmosphere was tense, though Elliot could not understand why. After 20 minutes, when there was still no movement, Ross became impatient. "Why are we—" Monroe clapped his hand over her mouth. He pointed to the clearing and mouthed one word. "Kijani." Ross's eyes went wide. Monroe took his hand away. There was a soft creak as the farmhouse door opened. Monroe picked up the machine gun, and then the Kijani stepped into the sunlight. Elliot counted 12 tall, muscular men armed with bows and arrows. Their legs and chests were streaked with white, and their faces were solid white, which gave their heads a menacing, skull-like appearance. The Kijani moved off, looking around tensely. Monroe remained watching the silent clearing for another 10 minutes. Finally, he stood and sighed.
"Those were Kijani,"
Monroe said. "What were they doing?" Ross said.
"Eating,"
Monroe said.
"They killed the family in that house, and then ate them."
He signaled Cahiga to get the men moving again, and they set off. They saw several other parties of Kijani, usually from a distance of many miles. At the end of the day, Monroe announced that they were now beyond the Kijani territory and safe. In a high clearing above Moruti, the place of soft winds, Monroe shouted Swahili instructions and Cahiga's porters began to unpack. Cahiga called to him in Swahili. Monroe turned to Ross and said,
"Cahiga wants to know how to pitch the tents."
Cahiga was holding a crumpled silver ball of fabric. Using a little hand pump, Ross inflated the first tent. It looked like a gleaming, ribbed Quonset hut. The porters clapped with delight. Monroe shook his head, amused. Amy signed to Elliot, "Amy want eat." "In a minute." Turning back, Elliot saw Ross setting up the transmitting equipment. First, Ross popped open the collapsed umbrella of the silver dish antenna, 5 feet in diameter. Then Ross attached the transmitter box. Finally, she hooked up the miniaturized computer terminal with its tiny keyboard and 3-inch video screen. Now she punched in code coordinates to lock the transmission to Houston and waited the 6 minutes until the transponders matched up. But the little screen continued to show only gray static. Someone was jamming them. Ross finally broke the jamming. She was gratified to see the little screen glow in a multicolored map of their position in the Congo. She punched in the field position lock, and a light blinked on the screen. Ross was prepared for bad news. According to her mental calculations, they had fallen some 70-odd hours behind their projected timeline. The jungle terrain before them was varied, and it would still take a minimum of 3 days to go 80 miles. That meant that they could no longer expect to beat the consortium to the site. They would be lucky if they arrived only 24 hours too late. To her surprise, the screen blinked. They were only 9 hours off their timeline.
What does that mean?
Monroe asked. There was only one possible conclusion. Something has slowed the consortium, Ross said. On the screen they read, Euro-Nippon Consortium legal trouble. Goma Airport, Zaire. Their aircraft found radioactive. Tough luck for them. Travis has been working back in Houston, Ross said. She could imagine what it must have cost Ertz to fix the rural airport. But it means we can still do it if we can make up the 9 hours.
We can do it,
Monroe said. Day 6, Licot, June 18, 1979. The next morning they entered the humid, perpetual gloom of the Congo rainforest. Elliot, never having been in a rainforest, was fascinated. He had expected the jungle to be much denser than it was. Their party moved through it freely. There were occasional bird calls and cries from monkeys, but otherwise a profound stillness settled over them. And it was oddly monotonous. Although he saw every shade of green in the foliage and creeper vines, there were few flowers. He had expected rotting decay, but that was not true either. But it was incredibly hot, and it seemed as though everything was wet. Elliot was surprised at how quickly he felt oppressed, and how soon he entertained thoughts of leaving. Cahiga offered to carry the electronic equipment, but Ross declined. She was obliged to try and link up with Houston at intervals, and at noon she managed to link through and register another field time position. They had lost nearly an hour since the previous check the night before.
We've got to go faster, she told Monroe. Perhaps you'd prefer to jog, Monroe said. He added, a lot can happen between here and Virunga.
When Monroe called a halt, Ross did not protest. Cahiga brought them food, and Monroe said,
Are the men all right?
Yes, Cahiga said. The men will not be afraid.
Afraid of what? Elliot said.
Keep eating. Just be natural, Monroe said.
Elliot looked nervously around.
Eat,
Monroe whispered.
Don't insult them. You're not supposed to know they're here.
The group ate in silence for several minutes, and then the nearby brush rustled, and a pygmy stepped out. He was a light-skinned man, about 4.5 feet tall, barrel-chested, wearing only a loincloth, with a bow and arrow over his shoulder. He looked around the expedition, apparently trying to determine the leader. Monroe stood and said something quickly in a language that was not Swahili. A brief conversation followed. The pygmy pointed off into the jungle several times.
He says a white man is dead in their village, Monroe said.
He picked up the first aid kit.
I'll have to hurry.
Ross said, We can't afford the time. Monroe frowned at her.
Well, the man's dead, she said. He's not completely dead, Monroe said. He's not dead forever.
The pygmy nodded vigorously, talking quickly to Monroe. He nodded, then turned to the others.
He says that the sick white man has some writing on his shirt pocket. He's going to draw the writing for us.
Ross glanced at her watch and sighed. The pygmy picked up a stick and drew large characters in the muddy earth. E-R-T-S. Oh, God, Ross said softly. The pygmies did not walk through the forest. They ran at a brisk trot. Occasionally they giggled at the difficulties of the 3 white people who followed. Finally, they came to a small stream and a sunlit clearing where the village was located. Elliot saw 10 low, rounded huts, arranged in a semicircle. At Monroe's signal, they were led in. Their arrival provoked great interest. Monroe gave Elliot cigarettes to pass out, 1 to each man. Preliminaries concluded they were taken where the dead white man was said to be. They found a filthy, bearded man of 30, sitting cross-legged, staring outward. Elliot realized the man was catatonic. He was not moving at all. Oh, my God, Ross said. It's Bob Driscoll.
You know him?
Monroe said. He was a geologist on the first Congo expedition. She waved her hand in front of his face. Bobby, it's me, Karen. Bobby, what happened to you? Driscoll did not even blink. One of the pygmies offered an explanation.
He came into their camp 4 days ago, Monroe said. They had to restrain him. Now he lets them feed him, but he never speaks.
Ross moved back in horror.
I don't see what we can do for him, Monroe said. Physically, he's okay, but...
He shook his head. I'll give Houston the location, Ross said, and they'll send help. During all this, Driscoll never moved. Elliot leaned forward, and as he approached, Driscoll wrinkled his nose. His body tensed. He broke into a high-pitched wail. Appalled, Elliot backed off, and Driscoll relaxed, falling silent again. What the hell was that all about? One of the pygmies whispered to Monroe.
He says, Monroe said, that you smell like gorilla.
2 hours later, they were reunited with Cahiga and the others, led by a pygmy guide. Their route took them west to the Ragora River. Monroe frowned at his map, and Ross frowned at her computer console. What's wrong with the Ragora River? Elliot asked.
Maybe nothing, Monroe said. Depends on how hard it's rained lately.
Ross glanced at her watch. We're now 12 hours behind, she said. The only thing we can do is continue straight through the night on the river.
I'd do that anyway, Monroe said.
You would? Why?
Because, Monroe said, the obstacles on the lower river will be much easier at night.
What obstacles?
We'll discuss them when we come to them, Monroe said.
A mile before they reached the Ragora, they heard the distant roar of powerful water. Amy was immediately anxious, signing, "What water?" Elliot tried to reassure her. But when they got to the Ragora, they found that the sound came from tumbling cataracts upstream. Directly before them, the river was 50 feet wide and a placid, muddy brown. Doesn't look too bad, Elliot said.
No, Monroe said, it doesn't.
But Monroe understood about the Ragora, a minor tributary of the Lualaba. The tribes along the river referred to it as the Deceitful Road, for the Ragora was notoriously changeable. Its principal feature was the Ragora Gorge, a limestone cut 200 feet deep and in places only 10 feet wide. Depending on recent rainfall, the Ragora Gorge was either a pleasant scenic spectacle or a boiling whitewater nightmare. They were still 15 miles upriver from the gorge, and conditions on the river told them nothing about conditions within the gorge. Monroe knew all that, but he did not feel it necessary to explain it to Elliot, particularly since Elliot was fully occupied with Amy. Amy had watched with growing uneasiness as Cahiga's men inflated the 2 Zodiac rafts. She tugged Elliot's sleeve and demanded to know, "What balloons?" "They're boats, Amy," he said. "Why boat?" she asked. "We ride boat now," Elliot said. Indeed, Cahiga's men were pushing the boats to the edge of the water and loading the equipment on. "Who ride?" she asked. "We all ride," Elliot said. "No," she signed. "Amy, no go." In the end, he was forced to load the CO2 gun and shoot a dart into her chest. She plucked out the dart with a sad expression. "Peter, no like Amy." "Sorry," Elliot said, and ran forward to catch her as her eyes rolled back and she collapsed into his arms. Amy lay on her back in the second boat at Elliot's feet. Ahead, Elliot saw Monroe standing in the first boat, leading the way as the Zodiac slid silently downstream. Monroe had divided the expedition into 2 rafts of 6 each. Monroe went in the first, and Elliot, Ross, and Amy went in the second, under Cahiga's command. As Monroe put it, the second boat would learn from our misfortunes. But for the first 2 hours on the Ragora, there were no misfortunes. "What is Monroe so worried about?" Elliot asked. "The crocodiles?"
No,
Cahiga said. "The Ragora Gorge?"
No,
Cahiga said. "Then what?"
after the gorge,
Cahiga said. Now the Ragora twisted, and they came around a bend and heard the growing roar of the water. Elliot felt the boat gathering speed. Cahiga shouted,
"Hold fast, doctors!"
And they were into the gorge. Afterward, Elliot had only fragmented, kaleidoscopic impressions. The churning, muddy water that boiled white in the sunlight, the erratic wrenching of his own boat, and the way Monroe's boat up ahead seemed to reel and upend, yet miraculously remained upright. And then suddenly the river broadened, the muddy water slowed, and the walls of the canyon moved apart. The river became peaceful again. Elliot slumped back, exhausted. "We made it," he said.
"So far,"
Cahiga said. They drifted downstream for another hour. It was as if the Ragora Gorge had never existed. The river was wide and sluggish gold in the descending sun. Elliot stripped off his soaking shirt and changed it for a pullover. Amy snored at his feet. Ross checked her transmitting equipment. When she was finished, the sun had set, and it was rapidly growing dark. Cahiga broke out a shotgun and inserted yellow, stubby shells. "What's that for?" Elliot said.
Kiboko, Cahiga said. Hippo.
"Are they dangerous?" Elliot asked.
At night we hope no, Cahiga said. But me, I think yes.
Day 7, Mukenko, June 19th, 1979. Monroe's intention in continuing through the night was twofold. First, he hoped to make up precious time. But, more important, he hoped to avoid the Rigora hippos, which could easily destroy their flimsy rubber boats. At night, when the animals went ashore to forage, the expedition could slip down the river and avoid a confrontation entirely. It was a clever plan, but it ran into trouble for an unexpected reason. Their progress on the Rigora was too rapid. It was only 9 o'clock at night when they reached the first hippo areas, too early for the animals to be eating. The hippos would attack in the dark. The river twisted and turned in a series of curves. At each curve there was a still pool, the kind of quiet water that hippos like to inhabit.
"Soon now,"
Cahiga said. They heard a low grunting. Monroe tensed in the lead boat. They drifted around another curve. The two boats were now about 10 yards apart. Monroe held his loaded shotgun ready. The sound came again, this time in a chorus. Cahiga plunged his paddle into the water. It struck bottom quickly. He pulled it out. Only 3 feet of it was wet.
"Not deep,"
he said, shaking his head. "Is that bad?" Ross said.
"Yes, I think it is bad."
They came around the next bend, and Elliot saw a half-dozen partially submerged black rocks near the shore. Then one of the rocks crashed upward, and the hippo churned toward Monroe's boat. Monroe fired a low magnesium flare as the animal charged, and then the hippo was engulfed in a cloud of pale yellow gas. The gas drifted back and stung their eyes. "He's using tear gas," Ross said. Monroe's boat had already moved on. With a roar of pain, the male hippo had plunged down and disappeared. In the second boat, they watched for him. "Perhaps he's given up," Elliot said. They drifted in silence. And suddenly the front of the boat bucked up, the hippo roared, and Ross screamed. Cahiga toppled backward, discharging his gun into the air. A huge, cavernous mouth came down on the side of the rubber boat, and the air began to hiss and sizzle in the water. The mouth opened again, but by then Cahiga had fired a stinging cloud of gas. The hippo backed off and splashed down, propelling them onward down the river. The whole boat was collapsing swiftly. Elliot grabbed Amy as the boat sank, and they found themselves standing knee-deep in the muddy water. They managed to beach the Zodiac on the dark riverbank. Monroe paddled over and announced they would inflate another boat and go on. He called for a rest, and they all lay in the moonlight on the river's edge. Their reverie was interrupted by the screaming whine of ground-to-air rockets, blossoming explosions in the sky overhead.
"General Maguru's men firing from the ground,"
Monroe said, reaching for his field glasses. "What are they shooting at?" Elliot said, staring into the sky.
"Beats me,"
Monroe said. Amy touched Monroe's arm and signed, "Bird, come!" And then they heard the drone of a distant aircraft approaching from the south.
"Those poor bastards are trying to make time,"
Monroe said, scanning the plane through field glasses.
"It's a C-130 transport. Japanese markings. Supply plane for the consortium base camp."
As they watched, the transport twisted left and right, running a zigzag course through the bursting fireballs. A moment later, the aircraft droned onward to the north, out of sight, a final missile chasing it, but it was gone over the jungle trees, and he listened to the distant explosion of the missile.
"Probably got through,"
Monroe said, standing.
"We'd better move on."
Mount Mukenko was classified as a fairly easy climb by most mountaineers, who generally devoted a day to the ascent. Above 9,000 feet, the pine forest disappeared, and they crossed grassy fields cloaked in chilly mist. The air was thinner, and they called frequently for arrest. Monroe had no patience with the complaints of his charges.
"What did you expect?" he demanded. "It's a mountain. Mountains are high."
Monroe humiliated them, chided them, encouraged them, and somehow kept them moving. Above 10,000 feet, the grass disappeared, and there was only mossy ground cover. The sun broke out at 11,000 feet. Soon they smelled sulphurous volcanic fumes drifting down from the summit, now 1,500 feet above them. Up here, there was only bare, hard rock and scattered patches of snow-tinged yellow from the sulphur. The last 1,000 feet were the most difficult, particularly for Amy, who had to pick her way barefoot among the sharp lava rocks. They reached the summit at 5 in the afternoon and gazed over the 8-mile-wide lava lake and smoking crater of the volcano. That night, the lava glowed in a network of hot red through the broken dark crust. Hissing steam rose into the sky. On the crater rim, their little tents reflected the red glow. Ross connected her transmitting equipment to make the nightly report to Houston. After the regular 6-minute delay, the signal linked directly through, without evasive techniques.
"Hell,"
Monroe said. "But what does it mean?" Elliot asked.
"It means,"
Monroe said gloomily,
"the consortium has stopped jamming us."
"Isn't that good?" "No," Ross said. "It's bad. They must already be on the site, and they've found the diamonds." She adjusted the video screen. "Houston confirms consortium on-site Zinj. Take no further risks. Situation hopeless."
"I can't believe it," Ross said. "It's all over."
Elliot sighed. "My feet hurt," he said.
"I'm tired,"
Monroe said. "The hell with it," Ross said. Utterly exhausted, they all went to bed. Day 8, Kanyamagufa, June 20th, 1979. Everyone slept late on the morning of June 20th. They had a leisurely breakfast, taking the time to cook a hot meal. They relaxed in the sun and played with Amy, who was delighted by this unexpected attention. It was past 10 o'clock before they started down Mukenko to the jungle. Back in the darkness of the equatorial rainforest, they proceeded directly toward the site. Toward midday, they came upon characteristic gorilla nests, made of eucalyptus leaves on the ground and in the trees. 15 minutes later, the air was shattered by a deafening roar.
"Gorilla,"
Monroe announced.
"That was a male telling somebody off."
Amy signed. "Gorillas say go away."
"We have to continue, Amy,"
he said. "Gorilla no want human people come." "Human people won't harm gorillas," Elliot assured her. But Amy just looked blank at this and shook her head, as if Elliot had missed the point. An hour later, they found the wreckage of the C-130 transport, the gigantic nose crushed against equally gigantic trees, the massive wings buckled. Through the shattered cockpit windshield, they saw the body of the pilot. Cahiga managed to climb an overturned tree, and from there moved onto one wing and looked into the interior. "No people," he said.
"Supplies?"
"Yes, many supplies. Boxes and containers."
Monroe left the others, walking beneath the crushed tail section to examine the far side of the plane. The port wing was blackened and shattered, the engines gone. That explained why the plane crashed. The last FZA missile had found its target, yet the wreck remained oddly mysterious to Monroe. Something was wrong. He looked along the length of the fuselage, past the rear exit doors.
"I'll be damned,"
Monroe said softly. He hurried back to the others. "Well," Ross said, "they didn't get their damn supplies."
"No," Monroe said. "And we saw this plane the night before last, which means it's been down at least 36 hours.
Monroe waited for Ross to figure it out. 36 hours?
"That's right, 36 hours.
And they never came back to get their supplies?"
"They didn't even try to get them," Monroe said. "Look at the main cargo doors. No one has tried to open them. I wonder why they never came back."
In a section of dense jungle, the ground underfoot crunched and crackled. Pushing aside the palm fronds, they saw a carpeting of shattered, white bones.
"Kanyamagufa,"
Monroe said. "A place of bones." He glanced quickly at the porters, but they showed only puzzlement. Amy lifted her feet from the sharp, bleached fragments. She signed, "Ground hurt." Elliot signed, "What place this?" "We come bad place." "What bad place?" Amy had no reply. "These are bones," Ross said, staring down at the ground.
"That's right," Monroe said quickly. "But they're not human bones, are they, Elliot?"
"They don't look human," Elliot agreed, staring at the ground. The majority of the bones came from small animals. Other small pieces were fragments from larger animals, but how large was hard to say. Perhaps gorillas. He saw one fragment from a cranium with heavy frontal sinuses.
"Elliot,"
Monroe said, his voice tense, insistent.
"Non-human."
"Definitely non-human," Elliot said, staring. What could shatter a gorilla skull? It must have happened after death, he decided.
"Not human,"
Monroe said, looking at the ground. As he walked past Elliot, he gave him a look.
"Keep your mouth shut. Cahiga and his men know that you are expert in these matters,"
Monroe said, looking at him steadily. What had Monroe seen? Elliot's glance fell on a curved bone. He picked it up. It was a fragment of a human skull. He turned the fragment in his hands. "At least these aren't human bones," Ross said. "No," Elliot agreed. He glanced at Amy. Amy signed, "People die here." "What did she say?" "She said people don't benefit from the air here."
"Let's push on,"
Monroe said. The consortium camp lay in ruins, the tents shredded and shattered, the dead bodies covered with flies. Everybody except Monroe hung back at the edge of the camp.
"No choice," he said. "We've got to know what happened to these—"
He went inside the camp itself, stepping over the flattened fence. As Monroe moved inside, the perimeter defenses were set off, emitting a screaming, high-frequency signal. Outside the fence, the others cupped their hands over their ears, and Amy snorted her displeasure. "Bad noise!" Monroe went to one dead body, turning it over with his foot. Then he bent down, carefully examining the head. Ross took a deep breath and crossed the perimeter. "I have to know what defenses they installed." "Fine," Elliot said. He felt dizzy. He saw Ross lift up a black box with an odd cone. She traced a wire back toward the center of the camp. Soon afterward, the high-frequency signal ceased. She had turned it off at the source. Amy signed, "Better now." Ross rummaged through the electronics equipment in the camp. Cahiga said, "I'll see if they have guns, Doctor." And he too moved into the camp. The other porters followed. Elliot remained with Amy. She impassively surveyed the destruction. He signed, "Amy, what happened this place?" Amy signed, "Things come." "What things?" "Bad things." "What things?" "Bad things come. Things come bad." "What things?" "Bad things." Obviously, he would get nowhere with this line of questioning. He told her to remain outside the camp and went in himself. Ross said, "Anybody find the leader?" Across the camp, Monroe said,
"Menard."
"Who's Menard?" Elliot asked. "He's got a good reputation, knows the Congo." Ross picked her way through the debris. "But he wasn't good enough."
"Cahiga!"
Monroe shouted, raising a green plastic 20-liter can. The can sloshed with liquid in his hand.
"Let's get this done!"
Cahiga and his men moved swiftly, splashing kerosene over the tents and dead bodies. Monroe turned to Elliot, who was watching Amy. Amy was signing to herself, "People bad. No believe people bad. Things come."
"She seems very calm about it,"
Monroe said. "Not really," Elliot said. "I think she knows what took place here."
"I hope she'll tell us," Monroe said, "because all these men died in the same way. Their skulls were crushed."
The flames from the consortium camp licked upward into the air as the expedition moved onward through the jungle. Ross was silent, lost in thought. Elliot said, "What did you find?" "Nothing good," she said. "They had a perfectly adequate peripheral system, quite similar to our animal defense perimeter. Those cones I found are audio-sensing units, and when they pick up a signal, they emit an ultra-high-frequency signal that is very painful to auditory systems. Send a wolf or a leopard running." But it didn't work here, Elliot said. No, Ross said. And it didn't bother Amy very much. Elliot said, what does it do to human auditory systems? You felt it. It's annoying, but that's all. She glanced at Elliot. But there aren't any human beings in this part of the Congo. Except us. Monroe asked, can we make a better perimeter defense? Damn right we can, Ross said. I'll give you the next generation perimeter. It'll stop anything except elephants and rhinos. But she didn't sound convinced. Late in the afternoon, they came upon the remains of the first Ertz Congo camp. There was not much left, and since the light was fading, they pressed on. Amy was distinctly agitated. She signed, no, go. Elliot paid no attention. Bad place, old place, no, go. We go, Amy, he said. 15 minutes later, they came to a break in the overhanging trees. Looking up, they saw the dark cone of Mukenko rising above the forest, and the moss-covered stone blocks, half concealed in jungle foliage, of the lost city of Zinj. Elliot turned to look at Amy. Amy was gone. They spent the next half hour wandering through the jungle, calling her name, but there was no response. Elliot was panic-stricken.
Maybe she ran off with the gorillas,
Monroe said. Impossible, Elliot said.
She's near maturity.
Monroe shrugged.
She is a gorilla.
Impossible, Elliot insisted. But he knew what Monroe was saying. Inevitably, people who raised apes found at a certain point they could no longer keep them.
Gorilla troops aren't closed,
Monroe reminded him.
They accept strangers, particularly female strangers.
She wouldn't do that, Elliot insisted. She couldn't. We'd better make camp, Ross said, glancing at her watch. She'll come back, if she wants to. They had brought a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne, but nobody was in a mood to celebrate. Elliot was remorseful over the loss of Amy. The others were horrified by what they had seen earlier. With night rapidly falling, there was much to do to set up the Ertz defense system. Cahiga and his men inflated the silvered mylar tents, arranging them close together. Ross directed the placement of infrared night lights on tripods. These were positioned shining outward around the camp. Next, the perimeter fence was installed. This was a lightweight metalloid mesh, more like cloth than wire. Attached to stakes, it completely enclosed the campsite, and when hooked to the transformer, carried 10,000 volts of electrical current. Monroe positioned the sentries. They would stand 4-hour watches. Monroe announced that he, Cahiga, and Elliot would take the first watch. The night passed quietly, without incident. Day 9, Zinj, June 21, 1979. Their entrance into the lost city of Zinj was accomplished with none of the mystery and romance of 19th century accounts of similar journeys. These 20th century explorers grunted under a load of technical equipment, all deemed essential to the modern high-speed evaluation of a ruined archaeological site. Ross expected to find her diamonds in 3 days. According to Ertz, the best way to do this was to draw up a ground plan of the city. With a plan in hand, it would be relatively simple to deduce mine locations. They expected a usable plan of the city within 6 hours. They moved through the ruined buildings, avoiding slithering snakes and giant spiders. They noticed that the stonework was of excellent quality, and everywhere they saw the half-moon curve of doors and windows. But aside from that curved shape, they found almost nothing distinctive. In general, the rooms were rectangular and roughly the same size. The walls were bare. They found no artifacts at all, although Elliot finally came upon a pair of disc-shaped stone paddles, which they presumed had been used to grind spices or grain. The bland quality of the city grew more disturbing as they continued. They began assigning arbitrary names to different buildings. When Ross found a series of cubbyholes carved into the walls of one room, she announced that this must be a post office. They came upon a row of small rooms with post holes for wooden bars. Elliot thought perhaps they were cages for a zoo. They found an open court they called the gymnasium. It was apparently an athletic field. There were 4 tall stone stakes with a crumbling stone ring at the top. Monroe wondered if the gymnasium was a training area for soldiers. They were all aware that their reactions simply mirrored their preoccupations. What they needed was objective information about the people who had built the city. It was there all along, although they were slow to realize it. In many rooms, one wall or another was overgrown with black-green mold.
"Damn strange,"
Monroe said, peering at the mold, rubbing his finger against it. His finger came away with traces of blue paint. That was how they discovered the elaborate bas-reliefs once painted that appeared throughout the city. After lunch, they returned to the ruins, lugging in the video camera, one of the infrared nightlights, and the tiny computer display screen. By shining infrared light on the walls and recording the image, and then feeding that image via satellite through computer programs in Houston, and returning it to their portable display unit, they were able to reconstruct the pictures on the walls. The scenes they saw provided them with their first insight into the city and its inhabitants. The people of Zinj were relatively tall blacks with muscular bodies. Despite the climate, they favored long robes. The first decoded frescoes showed marketplace scenes, sellers squatted beside baskets containing round objects, while buyers stood and bargained with them. The round objects, Ross decided, were stones. "Those are uncut diamonds," she said, staring at the screen. "They're selling diamonds." The frescoes led them to consider what had happened to the inhabitants of Zinj, for the city was clearly abandoned, not destroyed. Ross, voicing her deepest fears, suspected the diamond mines had given out. Elliot thought that a plague had overcome the inhabitants. Monroe thought the guerrillas were responsible.
"Don't laugh," he said. "This is a volcanic area. Eruptions, earthquakes, drought, fires. The animals go berserk and don't behave in the ordinary way."
"Nature on the rampage?" Elliot asked, shaking his head. "There are volcanic eruptions here every few years. It can't be that."
"Maybe there was a palace revolution, a coup."
"What would that matter to gorillas?" Elliot laughed.
"It happens," Monroe said. "In Africa, the animals always get strange when there's a war on, you know."
Elliot was unimpressed. "The natural world is indifferent to man," he said.
"Oh, no question," Monroe said. "But there isn't much natural world left."
Ross called Elliot away from his dinner. "It's for you," she said, pointing to the computer next to the antenna. Monroe grinned.
"Even in the jungle, the phone never stops ringing."
Elliot went over to look at the screen. Siemens, the Project Amy computer programmer, was calling him. "Incredible news," Siemens informed him. "Have found Mrs. Swenson." For a moment, Elliot did not recognize the name, and then he realized Mrs. Swenson, Amy's discoverer, the woman who had brought her from Africa. "Amy's mother not killed by natives," the screen printed. Elliot stared at the message. He had always been told that Amy's mother had been killed by natives in a village called Bagimindi. The mother had been killed for food, and Amy was orphaned. "What means," he typed. "Mother already dead, not eaten," came the on-screen reply. "Explain," Elliot typed. "Swenson has picture. Can transmit?" the screen asked. Elliot typed, "Transmit." There was a pause, and then the video screen received the transmission, scanning it from top to bottom. Long before the picture filled the screen, Elliot realized what it showed. A gorilla corpse with a crushed skull. The glowing electronic image faded to black. Elliot was confronted by a rush of sudden questions. Crushed skulls occurred in Kanyamagufa, the place of bones. But Bagimindi was more than 100 miles away. How had Amy and her dead mother reached Bagimindi? Why wasn't the mother eaten? Gorilla meat wasn't acceptable food in the Congo. He typed in a question, "Why mother not eaten?" The screen printed the reply. "Mother, infant, found by Native Army Patrol. Carried corpse, infant, 5 days to Bagimindi village. For sale, tourists. Swenson there." 5 days. Quickly, Elliot typed the important question, "Where found?" The answer came back, "Unknown area, Congo. No details, more pictures." "Send," he typed back. The screen went blank, and then filled once more. Now he saw a closer view of the female gorilla's crushed skull. and alongside the huge skull, a small black creature, mouth open, in a frozen scream. Amy. No wonder she's been having nightmares, Ross said. She probably saw her mother killed. Elliot said, well, at least we can be sure it wasn't gorillas. They don't kill each other. Right now, Ross said, we can't be sure of anything. The night of June 21st was so quiet that by 10 o'clock they switched off the infrared night lights to save power. Almost at once, they became aware of movement in the foliage outside the compound. Monroe and Cahiga swung their guns around. The rustling increased, and they heard an odd sighing sound, a sort of wheeze. Elliot heard it too, and felt a chill. It was the same wheezing recorded on the tapes from the first Congo expedition. They were all tense, alert, waiting. Then shortly before midnight, the electrified perimeter fence erupted in sparks. Monroe swung his gun around and fired. Ross hit the switch for the nightlights, and the camp was bathed in deep red.
Did you see it?
Monroe said.
Did you see what it was?
They shook their heads. Nobody had seen anything. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Day 10, Zinj, June 22nd, 1979. Elliot awoke at 6 a.m. Monroe was stalking around the perimeter of the camp. He greeted Elliot with a look of triumph and pointed to the ground. There were fresh footprints. They were deep and short, rather triangular-shaped, a wide space between the big toe and the other 4 toes. Definitely not human, Elliot said, bending to look closely. Some kind of primate. Monroe said nothing. It can't be a gorilla, Elliot finished, straightening.
It's a gorilla, all right,
Monroe said. He pointed to another area. There were 4 indentations in a row.
Those are the knuckles, when they walk on their hands.
But gorillas, Elliot said, are shy animals that sleep at night and avoid contact with men.
Tell the one that made this print.
It's small for a gorilla, Elliot said. He examined the fence nearby. Bits of gray fur clung to it, and gorillas don't have gray fur.
Males do,
Monroe said.
Silverbacks.
Yes, but the silverback coloring is whiter than this. This fur is distinctly gray. He hesitated. Maybe it's a kakundakari. Monroe looked disgusted. The kakundakari was a disputed primate in the Congo. Like the Yeti of the Himalayas, he had been sighted but never captured.
This print is from a gorilla,
Monroe insisted.
Or rather a group of gorillas. They've been scouting our camp.
Scouting our camp, Elliot repeated, shaking his head.
That's right, Monroe said. Just look at the bloody prints.
Elliot felt his patience growing short. He said something about white hunter campfire tales, to which Monroe said something unflattering about people who knew everything from books. At that point, the colobus monkeys in the trees overhead began to shriek and shake the branches. They found Malawi's body just outside the compound. The porter's skull had been crushed. Monroe bent to examine the injury.
You notice these flattened areas of compression, as if the head was squeezed between something.
Monroe called for the stone paddles that Elliot had found in the city the day before. Monroe placed the paddles to either side of Malawi's head. They fitted the semicircular indentations perfectly.
A man hasn't the strength to do this,
Monroe said flatly.
Judging by the way he fell, Malawi was standing when it happened.
Monroe faced Elliot.
Large animal, the size of man. A gorilla.
Elliot had no reply. After examining the body, Elliot went to the stream to wash his hands. He heard a rustling in the bushes across the stream, and an enormous silverback male gorilla reared up. Elliot was wondering what he should do when suddenly the gorilla crashed noisily away through the underbrush. This encounter perplexed him. Then another gorilla rose up, this one smaller. A female, he thought. Then the hand moved.
Peter, come, give tickle.
Amy, he shouted, and a moment later he had splashed across the stream and she had leapt into his arms, grunting happily. Elliot conducted the subsequent conversation entirely in sign language. Amy, he signed. Why Amy leave? Peter not like Amy. Peter like Amy. Peter hurt Amy. Peter fly. Ouch pin. Amy no like Peter. No like Amy. Amy sad. Sad. Increasingly rapid signing was an indication that she was upset. Where Amy go? Amy go gorillas. Good gorillas. Amy like. Gorillas nice to Amy? With a smug look. Yes, gorillas give food. What gorillas give food? All give food. Amy. Take food. Amy like. Gorillas nice to Amy? Gorillas like Amy. Amy like gorillas. Like Amy. Like gorillas. Why Amy come back? For a long time she did not answer. Amy like Peter. Amy sad. Want Peter. He felt like crying. Peter good human person. Blinking his eyes, he signed, Peter tickle Amy. She jumped into his arms. Later he questioned her in more detail, but it was a painstakingly slow process. Elliot phrased his questions carefully. He asked Amy, what happened at night, with the gorillas? She gave him the look she always gave him when she thought a question was obvious. Amy sleep night. And the other gorillas? Gorillas sleep night. All the gorillas? She disdained to answer. Amy, he said, gorillas come to our camp at night. Come this place? Yes, this place. Gorillas come at night. She thought that over. No. Monroe said, what did she say? Elliot said, she said no. Yes, Amy, they come. She was silent a moment, and then she signed, things come. Monroe again asked what she had said. She said, things come. Elliot translated the rest of her responses for them. Ross asked, what things, Amy? Bad things. Monroe said, were they gorillas, Amy? Not gorillas, bad things. Many bad things come forest, come. Breath talk. Come night, come. Monroe said, where are they now, Amy? Amy looked around at the jungle. Here, this bad old place, things come. Ross said, are the bad things people, Amy? Are they human persons? No. Monroe said, monkeys? No. Bad things, not sleep night. Monroe said, she knows what gorillas are. Amy, good gorilla, she signed. Yes, you are, Elliot said. She's saying she's a good gorilla. Monroe frowned. So she knows what gorillas are, but she says these things are not gorillas. That's what she says. Elliot, Monroe, and Ross spent a hot, difficult morning hacking their way through the dense jungle growth to reach new buildings in the city. By midday, their efforts were rewarded as they entered structures unlike any they had seen before. These buildings were impressively engineered, enclosing vast, cavernous spaces, descending 3 and 4 stories beneath the ground. Ross was delighted by the underground constructions, for it proved to her that the Zinj people had evolved the technology necessary for diamond mines. Monroe expressed a similar view. These people, he said, could do anything with earthworks. They found nothing of interest in the depths of the city. They ascended to higher levels later, coming upon a building so filled with reliefs that they termed it the gallery. With a video camera hooked to the satellite link-up, they examined the pictures in the gallery. These showed aspects of ordinary city life. There were domestic scenes, hunting scenes, and finally scenes of mining, men carrying baskets of stones from tunnels. In this rich panorama, they noticed certain missing elements. The people of Zinj had pets, yet it had apparently never occurred to them to use animals as beasts of burden. And they apparently never discovered the wheel. Monroe looked at the pictures and finally said, something else is missing. They were looking at a scene from the diamond mines.
course, Monroe said, snapping his fingers. No police.
Elliot suppressed a smile. He considered it only too predictable that Monroe would wonder about police in this long-dead society. But Monroe insisted his observation was significant.
Look here, he said. This city existed because of its diamond mines. It was a classic one-crop economy, and yet they didn't guard it.
Ross suggested that perhaps they didn't need guards.
Human nature doesn't change,
Monroe insisted. When they left the gallery, they came to an open courtyard. The courtyard had a formal quality, heightened by the pillars of a temple-like building to one side. Their attention was immediately drawn to the courtyard floor. Strewn across the ground were dozens of stone paddles, of the kind previously found.
I'll be damned, Elliot said.
They picked their way through this field of paddles and entered the temple. It consisted of a single large square room. Directly ahead, they saw an enormous mound of vines, perhaps 10 feet high. Then they recognized it was a statue. Elliot climbed up on the statue and began stripping away the clinging foliage. He glanced back at Monroe. Better?
Come and look,
Monroe said, with an odd expression on his face. Elliot climbed down, stepped back to look. He could clearly see an enormous, standing gorilla, the face fierce, the arms stretched wide. In each hand, the gorilla held stone paddles like cymbals, ready to swing them together.
My God, Elliot said.
Gorilla, Monroe said with satisfaction. Ross said, it's all clear now. These people worshipped gorillas. It was their religion. But why would Amy say they weren't gorillas?
Ask her,
Monroe said, glancing at his watch.
I have to get us ready for tonight.
When dinner was finished, Monroe took Elliot aside and said,
Chain Amy in your tent. If we start shooting tonight, I'd hate to have her running around in the dark. Explain to her that it may get very noisy from the guns.
Is it going to get very noisy? Elliot said.
I imagine,
Monroe said. Elliot took Amy into his tent and put on the sturdy chain leash she often wore in California. He tied one end to his cot, but Amy could move it easily. He made her promise to stay in the tent. She promised. He stepped to the tent entrance, and she signed, Amy like Peter. Peter like Amy, he said, smiling. Everything's going to be fine. He emerged into another world. In the flickering glow of the campfire, he saw sentries in position around the compound. Elliot suddenly sensed the precariousness of their position. A handful of frightened people deep in the Congo rainforest, miles from the nearest human habitation. Waiting. The hours passed, 11 o'clock, and then midnight, and then 1 o'clock. He heard Amy snoring in his tent. He glanced over at Ross sleeping on the ground. He looked at his watch and yawned. Nothing was going to happen tonight. Monroe was wrong. Then he heard the breathing sound. The sentries heard it too, swinging their guns in the darkness. The wheezing sighs seemed to come from all parts of the jungle at once, drifting with the night fog, soft and pervasive. The colobus monkeys began to shriek in the trees overhead, and the first of the gorillas silently charged. He had a glimpse of an enormous animal, distinctly gray in color, racing up to him. A moment later, the gorillas hit the electrified fence with a shower of spitting sparks and the odor of burning flesh. The gorillas attacked from all directions. 6 of them simultaneously hit the fence and were repelled in a crackling burst of sparks. And then he saw gorillas in the trees overhanging the campsite. Monroe and Cahiga began firing upward. Elliot turned and saw more gorillas tearing at the fence, which had gone dead. There were no more sparks. Deafening machine gun fire had an immediate effect on the gorillas. They backed off in disorder. Then the jungle around them was still. The gorillas were gone. Day 11, Zinj, June 23, 1979. The gorilla corpses lay stretched on the ground, the bodies already stiffening. Elliot spent 2 hours examining the animals, both adult males in the prime of life. The most striking feature was the uniform gray color. The 2 known races of gorilla both had black hair. By the age of 12, adult males had developed the silver patch along their back and rump, the sign of sexual maturity. With age, gorillas turn gray in much the same way as people. But from their teeth, Elliot estimated that these males were no more than 10 years old. All their pigmentation seemed lighter, eye and skin color as well as hair. Next, Elliot measured the bodies. These animals stood about 4 feet 6 inches tall. They were distinctly small for adult male gorillas. Elliot recorded 30 additional skeletal measurements for later analysis back in San Francisco. By midday, his conclusion was clear. This was at least a new race of gorilla, and it was possibly a new species of animal entirely. Elliot found he was bored by the prospect of further exploration of Zinj. He had no interest in diamonds, or Amy's dreams. He wished only to return home with the skeleton of the new ape, which would astonish colleagues around the world. Elliot was dazzled by his own prospects. In retrospect, no one was thinking clearly that morning. When they heard booming explosions like distant artillery fire that morning, they paid no attention. And because Ross skipped the morning transmission to Houston, she was not informed of new geological changes that might have given new significance to the detonations. They were secure in their sense of indomitable power. Only Monroe remained immune. He had checked their ammunition supplies with discouraging results. Monroe said, "Last night consumed half of our total ammunition." "What can we do?" Elliot asked.
"I was hoping you'd have an answer for that," Monroe said. "You examined the bodies."
Elliot stated his belief that they were confronted with a new species of primate. He summarized the anatomical findings which supported his beliefs.
"That's all well and good," Monroe said, "but I'm interested in how they act. Gorillas are usually shy and avoid men, while these attack men fearlessly. Why?"
Elliot had to admit that he didn't know.
"Considering our ammunition supplies, I think we'd better find out," Monroe said.
The logical place to begin was the temple, with its enormous, menacing gorilla statue. They returned that afternoon and found, behind the statue, a succession of small, cubicle-like rooms. Ross thought that priests who worshipped the cult of the gorilla lived there. "People worship what they fear," Ross said, hoping to control it.
"But how could they control the gorillas?" Monroe asked. "What could they do?"
When the answer finally came, it was startling. They moved past the cubicles to a series of long corridors, decorated with bas-reliefs. Using their infrared computer system, they were able to see the reliefs, which were scenes arranged in a careful order. The first scene showed a series of caged gorillas. A black man stood near the cages, holding a stick. The second picture showed an African standing with 2 gorillas, holding ropes around their necks. A third showed an African instructing the gorillas in a courtyard. The gorillas were tethered to vertical poles, each with a ring at the top. The final picture showed the gorillas attacking a line of straw dummies, which hung from an overhead stone support. They now knew the meaning of what they had found. "My God," Elliot said, "they trained them." Monroe nodded. "Trained them as guards, to watch over the mines. An animal elite, ruthless and incorruptible. Not a bad idea when you think about it." Ross looked around her, realizing it wasn't a temple, but a school. An objection occurred to her. These pictures were hundreds of years old, the trainers long gone. Who teaches them now? "They do," Elliot said. "They teach each other." "Is that possible?" "Perfectly possible. Teaching occurs among primates." "And they use stone tools?" she asked. "Stone paddles?" "Yes," Elliot said. "But why would Amy say they weren't gorillas?" "Because they're not," Elliot said. "These animals don't look like gorillas, and they don't act like gorillas. They are physically and behaviorally different." He went on to voice his suspicion that not only had these animals been trained, they had been bred, perhaps interbred with chimpanzees, or, more strangely still, with men. And as Elliot saw it, the animals the Zingians had trained presented an awesome problem. "We have to face the realities," he said. "When Amy was given a human IQ test, she scored 92. These gray gorillas possess that same intelligence, yet they have been trained for cunning and viciousness. They will continue their attacks until they succeed in killing us all, as they have killed everyone who has come here before." Ross ran a computer simulation through Houston, which came back with a probability course of 3 days and a standard deviation of 2 days to find the diamond mines. That meant they should be prepared for 5 more days at the site. Food was not a problem, but ammunition was. Monroe proposed to use tear gas. They expected the gray gorillas to try a different approach, and they did, attacking immediately after dark. The battle on the night of June 23rd was punctuated by the coughing explosions of canisters and the sizzling hiss of the gas. The strategy was effective. The guerrillas were driven away and did not return again that night. Monroe was pleased. He announced that they had enough tear gas to hold off the guerrillas for a week, perhaps more. For the moment, their problems appeared to be solved. Day 12, Zinj, June 24th, 1979. Shortly after dawn, they discovered the bodies of Mulewi and Akari near their tent. Apparently, the attack the night before had been a diversion, allowing one gorilla to enter the compound, kill the porters, and slip out again. Even more disturbing, they could find no clue to how the gorilla had got through the electrified fence and back out again. A careful search revealed a section of fence torn near the bottom. A long stick lay on the ground nearby. The gorillas had used the stick to lift the fence, enabling one to crawl through, and the gorillas had carefully restored the fence to its original condition. The intelligence implied by such behavior was hard to accept. Monroe later related,
"I concluded that since these animals had been trained by men, I had to think of them as men. The question became, what would I do if they were men?"
For Monroe, the answer was clear: take the offensive. Amy agreed to lead them into the jungle where she said the gorillas lived. By 10 o'clock that morning, they were moving up the hillsides north of the city, armed with machine guns. 10 minutes later, they came upon a group of 10 gray gorillas feeding on succulent vines. They all seemed remarkably unguarded. Monroe gave a hand signal. The safeties clicked off the guns. He prepared to fire into the group when Amy tugged at his trouser leg. He looked off
and had the shock of my bloody life. Up the slope was another group. There must have been 300 or more. The hillside was crawling with gray gorillas.
Elliot found 300 animals, an awesome sight. But he was even more impressed by the behavior of the animals. From the first sighting, I never had any doubt that they had language. Their wheezing vocalizations clearly constituted a form of language. In addition, they used sign language. Obviously, the gorillas had been taught, or had elaborated on their own, a language system. Finally, at Monroe's signal, they slipped back down the trail and returned to the camp. They discussed their alternatives.
"How many animals on the hillside are males?"
Monroe asked. Only male animals participated in the attacks. Monroe was asking for odds. Elliot said most studies have found that adult males constitute 15% of gorilla groupings. The arithmetic was disheartening. There were probably 60 attacking animals, and only 9 in their defending group.
"Hard,"
Monroe said, shaking his head. Amy had one solution. She signed, "Go, now." Ross asked what she said, and Elliot told her, "She wants to leave. I think she's right." "Don't be ridiculous," Ross said. "We haven't found the diamonds. We can't leave now." "Go, now," Amy signed again. They looked at Monroe.
"I want the diamonds as much as anyone," he said. "They won't be much use to us if we're dead. We have no choice. We must leave if we can."
Ross swore in florid Texas style. Elliot said to Monroe, "What do you mean, if we can?"
"I mean," Monroe said, that they may not let us leave."
Following Monroe's instructions, they carried only minimal supplies of food and ammunition. They left everything else. Monroe thought if they could reach the eastern slopes of Mukenko, they would be all right. The gray guerrillas would not follow them far. 1 or 2 hours walking, and they would be beyond danger. He checked his watch. They had been gone 10 minutes. And then he heard the sighing sound. It seemed to come from all directions. He saw the foliage moving before him. He heard the sighing grow louder. The column halted at the edge of a ravine. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. Along the line, he heard the safeties click on the machine guns. Cahiga came up.
"Captain, what do we do?"
Monroe watched the foliage move and heard the sighing. He could only guess at the numbers concealed in the bush. 20, 30? Too many in any case.
"Back," Monroe said. "We go back."
When they turned away from the ravine, the sighing faded, and the foliage ceased its movement. When he looked back, the ravine appeared without threat of any kind. But Monroe knew the truth. They could not leave. Elliot's idea came in a flash of insight. "I was looking at Amy signing to Cahiga," he later related. "It occurred to me that the linguistic skill of the gray guerrillas was both their great advantage and their Achilles' heel." Now he looked at Amy and said, "Amy, listen to Peter." She stared at him. "Amy, understand thing talk?" "Amy, understand thing talk," she signed back. She did it so matter-of-factly that at first he wondered if she realized what he was asking her. "Amy, watch thing talk? Amy, understand talk?" "Amy, understand." "Amy, sure?" "Amy, sure." "I'll be goddamned," Elliot said. Monroe was shaking his head.
"We've only got a few hours of daylight left," he said. "And even if you do learn their language, how are you going to talk to them?"
At 3 p.m., Elliot and Amy were completely concealed in the foliage along the hillside. The only sign of their presence was the microphone that protruded through the foliage. The microphone was connected to the videotape recorder at Elliot's feet, which he used to record the sounds of the guerrillas on the hills beyond. He could never be quite sure that Amy was translating the verbal utterances of the same animal he was recording, yet he had to trust her. After another hour, with the sunlight fading, he took Amy back down the hillside to the camp. Monroe had planned as best he could. He cut down the low tree branches overhanging the camp, so that if guerrillas went into the trees, they would be kept at least 30 feet above the ground, too high to jump down. He gave 3 of the remaining porters shotguns, along with a supply of tear gas canisters. With Ross, he boosted power on the perimeter fence to almost 200 amps, the maximum the thin mesh could handle without melting. The first animals to hit that fence would be immediately killed. At sunset, Monroe loaded half their remaining ammunition. When that was gone, Monroe was counting on Elliot and Amy and their translation. And Elliot did not look very happy when he came back down the hill.
"How long until you're ready?"
Monroe asked him. "Couple of hours, maybe more." Elliot asked Ross to help him. Ross said, "Did it work?" "We'll know in a minute," Elliot said. His first plan was to run the only kind of internal check on Amy that he could, by verifying repetitions of sounds. If she had consistently translated sounds in the same way, they would have a reason for confidence. But it was painstaking work. They called for silence from the others in the camp and proceeded to run the checks, taping, retaping, listening to the whispering sounds. Every half hour, Monroe would wander over to ask how it was coming. "We're going as fast as we can," Ross snapped. It was now 8 o'clock. But the first results were encouraging. Amy was indeed consistent in her translations. By 9 o'clock, they had 11 reliable vocabulary words recorded on tape. Elliot's problem now was to compose an unequivocal message. He eventually decided on 3 messages: "Go away," "No come," and "Bad here." By 9 o'clock, they had isolated the specific sound components, but they still had a complicated task ahead. What Elliot needed was a loop, repeating the sounds over and over. For the next hour, they frantically punched buttons, trying to bring the word combinations close enough together to sound, to their ears, correct. By then, it was after 10. Monroe came over.
You think all this will work?
Elliot shook his head. There's no way to know. Equally uncertain was the problem of broadcasting. Ross made a speaker, removing the tiny speaker from the pocket tape recorder and gluing it to an umbrella on a collapsible tripod. This produced surprisingly loud volume, but reproduction was muffled. Shortly afterward, they heard the first sighing sounds. Once again, the sighing came from all directions. Monroe and the others quickly took positions along the perimeter, crouching tensely. The sighing continued for several minutes longer, and then slowly faded away. "What was that about?" Ross said. Monroe frowned.
They're waiting.
"For what?" Monroe shook his head. He didn't know what to expect. Then he heard the rumble of thunder. Cahiga pointed to the sky, shaking his head. That was their answer.
Damn,
Monroe said. At 10:30, a torrential tropical rain poured down on them. The nightlights flickered, the rain shorted the electrical cables, and the perimeter fence went dead. And worst of all, the rain splattering the foliage was so noisy the loudspeaker probably could not work and certainly would not carry over the rain. 5 minutes later, the guerrillas attacked. The rain masked their approach. They seemed to burst out of nowhere, striking the fence from 3 directions simultaneously. From that first moment, Elliot realized the guerrillas now were intent on finishing the job. Elliot saw 10 or 15 animals inside the compound, trampling the tents and attacking the people. Azizi was killed immediately, his skull crushed between paddles. Monroe, Cahiga, and Ross all fired, but in the confusion and poor visibility, their effectiveness was limited. Elliot turned back to the recording equipment and switched on the tape replay. By now the guerrillas had overwhelmed everyone. Monroe lay on his back, a gorilla on top of him. Ross was nowhere to be seen. Cahiga had a gorilla clinging to his chest as he rolled in the mud. They were finished. It was only a matter of time. A gorilla charged Elliot, bellowing in rage, swinging stone paddles wide. 6 feet away, the charging gorilla stopped so abruptly that he literally skidded in the mud and fell backward. He sat there surprised, cocking his head, listening. Then Elliot realized that the rain had nearly stopped. Looking across the compound, Elliot saw another gorilla stop to listen, then another, and another, and another. They were listening to the broadcast sounds. He held his breath, not daring to hope. The gorillas seemed uncertain, confused. They stepped away from the people, listening. Monroe scrambled to his feet, raising his gun from the mud. But he did not shoot. The gorilla standing over him seemed to be in a trance. In the gentle rain, with the flickering nightlights, the gorillas moved away, one by one. They seemed perplexed, off balance. The rasping continued over the loudspeaker. The gorillas left, disappearing once more into the jungle. And then the expedition members were alone, shivering in the misty rain. The gorillas were gone. Day 13, Mukenko, June 25, 1979. In the morning, a fine layer of black ash covered the campsite, and in the distance, Mukenko was belching great quantities of black smoke. Amy tugged at Elliot's sleeve. "Leave now," she signed insistently. "No, Amy," he said. Nobody in the expedition was in a mood to leave, including Elliot. Upon arising, he found himself thinking of additional data he needed before leaving Zinj: a skeleton, videotapes, and more recordings. And Ross was more determined than ever to find the diamonds, with Monroe no less interested. "Leave now!" "Why leave now?" he asked her. "Earth bad! Leave now!" Elliot had no experience with volcanic activity. He asked Monroe, "Is there any danger?" Monroe shrugged.
Cahiga thinks so, but he probably just wants an excuse to go home.
Amy came running over to Monroe. She signed to him.
"What's he saying?"
Monroe asked. "She says leave now," Elliot translated. "She says the earth is bad."
Monroe said. "Interesting."
He glanced at Amy and then at his watch. Amy signed, "Nose hair man, listen! Amy, go home, now!" "She says you listen to her and go home now," Elliot said. Monroe shrugged.
"Tell her I understand."
Elliot translated. Amy looked unhappy and did not sign again.
"Where is Ross?"
Monroe asked. "Here," Ross said.
"Let's get moving,"
Monroe said, and they headed for the lost city. Amy signed she was coming with them. This was their final day in the city, and all the participants in the Congo expedition described a similar reaction. They all found it tedious, except for Monroe. Monroe was worried. He kept listening to the distant rumbling of Mukenko. The lost city of Zinj could be filled in minutes with a heavy, poisonous atmosphere, should Mukenko discharge a large quantity of gas. The question was how quickly Mukenko was building toward a major eruptive phase. That was why Monroe was so interested in Amy's reactions. Primates could anticipate geological events such as earthquakes and eruptions. Monroe was surprised that Elliot didn't know about that. And he was even more surprised that Ross, with her extensive geological knowledge, did not regard the morning ashfall as the start of a major volcanic eruption. Ross knew a major eruption was building. That morning she had routinely tried to establish contact with Houston. To her surprise, the screen went blank and flashed, "Houston Station Override. Clear banks." This was an emergency signal. She cleared the memory banks and pushed the transmit button. The screen printed, "Computer designation, major eruption, signature Mukenko. Advise leave site now. Expedition jeopardy. Repeat, all leave site now." Ross glanced up at the smoking cone of Mukenko. The hell with it, she thought. She wanted the diamonds, and she had gone too far to quit now. The screen blinked. "Please signal reply." Ross turned the transmitter off. As the morning progressed, they felt several sharp, jolting earth tremors, which released clouds of dust from the crumbling buildings. The rumblings of Mukenko became more frequent. Ross paid no attention. "If you want diamonds," she said, shrugging, "you go to volcanoes." Most diamond mines were at the site of extinct volcanoes. Shortly before noon, they found them, halfway up the hills east of the city, a series of excavated tunnels running into the mountain slopes of Mukenko. Elliot felt disappointed. "I don't know what I was expecting," he said later, "but it was just a tunnel, with occasional bits of dull brown rock sticking out. I couldn't understand why Ross got so excited. Those bits of dull brown rock were diamonds. When cleaned, they had the transparency of dirty glass. The others thought I was crazy," Ross said later, "because I began jumping up and down, but they didn't know what they were looking at." The Zinj mines were lumpy with protruding stones. Using his machete, Monroe dug out 600 carats. "Just looking," Ross said later, "I could see easily 4,000 or 5,000 carats. It was unbelievable." Elliot asked, "If this mine is so damn rich, why was it abandoned?"
"The guerrillas got out of control," Monroe said. "They staged a coup."
He was laughing, plucking diamonds out of the rock. Ross thought a less exotic explanation was likely. "I think," she said, "that as far as they were concerned, the diamond mines had dried up." Because as gemstones, these crystals were very poor indeed, blue, streaked with impurities. The people of Zinj could not have imagined that 500 years in the future, these same worthless stones would be more scarce and desirable than any other mineral resources on the planet. Ross began unpacking her rucksack, taking out a series of white ceramic cones and small boxes with antennae. She attached a box to each cone, then entered the first tunnel, placed the cones flat against the walls, moving deeper into darkness. She emerged from one tunnel and disappeared into the second. Elliot saw the glow of her flashlight as she placed the cones, and then she was hidden from view. Monroe came out into the sunlight, his pockets bulging with diamonds.
"Where's Ross?"
"In the tunnels."
"Doing what?"
"Some kind of explosive test, looks like." Elliot gestured to the 3 remaining ceramic cones near her pack. Monroe picked up one cone.
"Do you know what these are?"
he asked. Elliot shook his head.
"They're RCs,"
Monroe said.
She's out of her mind to place them here. She could blow the whole place apart.
Resonant conventionals, or RCs, were timed explosives, a potent marriage of microelectronic and explosive technology.
We used RCs 2 years ago on bridges in Angola, Monroe explained. Properly sequenced, 6 ounces of explosive can bring down 50 tons of braced structural steel. Resonating waves literally shake the structure to pieces.
Monroe glanced up at Mukenko, smoking above them. At that moment, Ross emerged from the tunnel, all smiles. "We'll soon have our answers," she said.
Answers?
"About the extent of the deposits. I've set 12 seismic charges."
You set 12 resonant charges?
Monroe said. "Well, they're all I brought. We've got to make that do."
They'll do, Monroe said. Perhaps too well. That volcano, he pointed upwards, is in an eruptive phase.
"I've placed a total of 800 grams of explosive," Ross said. "That's less than 1.5 pounds. It can't make the slightest difference."
Let's not find out.
Elliot listened to their argument with mixed feelings. Monroe's objections seemed absurd. As the argument continued, Amy picked up the detonating device lying alongside Ross's pack. She glanced over at the humans.
No, Amy,
Monroe said.
He turned to Elliot. Can't you stop her?
"Oh, what the hell," Ross said. "Go ahead, Amy." A series of rumbling explosions blasted from the mine shafts, and then there was silence. "Well," Ross said, "I hope you're satisfied. It's perfectly clear that such a minimal explosive charge could not affect the volcano, and then Mukenko rumbled, and the earth shook so hard that they were all knocked to the ground. For Elliot, Ross, and Monroe, the 5 minutes following the onset of the eruption were a bizarre nightmare. Elliot recalled that everything was moving. We had to crawl. The city swayed like a wobbling toy before the buildings began to collapse. Then everything came down at once. The trees were swaying too, and pretty soon they began falling over. The noise of this collapse was incredible, and added to that was the sound from Mukenko. The volcano wasn't rumbling anymore. They heard staccato explosions of lava blasting from the cone. It was, Elliot recalled, just like being in the middle of a war. Amy was panic-stricken. Grunting in terror, she leapt into Elliot's arms as they began to run back toward the camp. Monroe was the first to reach camp. He found Cahiga trying to pack for their departure, but it was impossible with the tremors. "Leave!" Monroe shouted. "Leave!" Grabbing his pack hastily, Cahiga glanced back toward the others, and in that moment, Elliot stumbled out of the black gloom with Amy clinging to his chest. "Leave!" Monroe shouted. As Elliot moved on, Ross emerged from the darkness of the ashen atmosphere, coughing, bent double. She pointed to her nose and throat, coughing. "Burns! Hurts!"
It's the gas,
Monroe shouted. He put his arm around her and half lifted her, carrying her away.
"We have to get uphill."
An hour later, on higher ground, they had a final view of the city engulfed with smoke and ash. Farther up on the slopes of the volcano, a line of trees burst into flames as a dark wave of lava came sliding down the mountainside. They heard agonized bellows of pain from the gray gorillas on the hillside as hot lava rained down on them. As they watched, the foliage collapsed closer and closer to the city, until finally the city itself crumbled under a darkly descending cloud and disappeared. The lost city of Zinj was buried forever. Only then did Ross realize that her diamonds were buried forever as well. Monroe planned to head directly for the wrecked C-130 transport, which would afford them shelter and supplies. He estimated they would reach the aircraft in 2 hours. In fact, 6 hours passed before the gigantic ash-covered hulk of the plane emerged from the murky afternoon darkness. One reason it had taken them so long was that they were obliged to avoid General Muguru and his troops.
"He's not a fellow you want to meet,"
Monroe said. Far in the distance they heard the soft beating of Kijani drums and thumping mortar from Muguru's troops. Otherwise, it was ominously quiet. Monroe waited in the forest beyond the wreckage, watching the airplane. Finally, Monroe signaled, and they all began to move forward. Amy, panicked, tugged at Monroe's sleeve. "No, go," she signed. "People there." Monroe frowned at her. Elliot pointed to the airplane. Moments later, 2 white-painted Kijani warriors emerged from the aircraft onto the high wing. They were carrying cases of whiskey. After a moment, 5 more Kijani appeared beneath the wing, and the cases were passed to them. The 2 men above jumped down, and the group moved off. Monroe looked at Amy and smiled. "Amy, good gorilla," she signed. When no further Kijani appeared, Monroe led the group to the airplane. They were just outside the cargo doors when a rain of white arrows began to whistle down on them. "Inside!" Monroe shouted, and hurried them all into the airplane. He slammed the emergency door. Arrows clattered on the outer metal surface. Inside it was dark, the floor tilted. Boxes of equipment had slid across the aisles, toppled over and smashed. Outside they heard drums and the steady rain of arrows on the metal and windows. Looking out, they glimpsed dozens of white-painted men. "What are we going to do?" Ross asked. "Shoot them," Monroe said briskly, breaking open the supplies on board, removing machine gun clips. "We aren't short of ammunition." "But there must be 100 men out there." "Yes, but only 1 man is important. Kill the Kijani with red streaks painted beneath his eyes. That'll end the attack right away." "Why?" Elliot asked. "Because he's the Ungawa sorcerer," Monroe said, moving to the cockpit. "Kill him, and we're off the hook." Poison-tipped arrows clattered on the plastic windows and rang against the metal. The drums beat constantly. Amy was terrified and buckled herself into a seat, signing, "Amy, leave now! Bird, fly! Amy, want, go!" "Soon, Amy," Elliot said, hoping it would prove true. By now the Kijani were attacking from the rear. 2 warriors managed to climb through the open aft cargo door. Ross fired at the rear door, and the intruding Kijani were knocked out backward. "Amy no like," she signed. "Amy want go home." She clutched her seatbelt. "There's the son of a bitch!" Monroe shouted and fired his machine gun. A young man, his eyes smeared with red, fell onto his back, shuddering with machine gun fire. "Got him," Monroe said. "Got the Ungawa!" It was then the Kijani attack ended, the warriors retreating. Monroe stared out at the jungle. "What happens now?" Elliot asked. "Have we won?" Monroe shook his head. "They'll wait for nightfall. Then they'll come back to kill us all." Ross approached him. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" "Yes," Monroe said. He didn't mention the volcano. "I suppose I made a mistake." "Well, you can atone," Monroe said, "by thinking of some way out." "I'll see what I can do," she said seriously, and went aft. 15 minutes later, she screamed. Monroe spun back into the passenger compartment, his machine gun raised to fire, but he saw that Ross had collapsed into a seat, laughing hysterically. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Get a grip on yourself," he said, but she just went on laughing. Cahiga stood next to a gas cylinder marked propane.
She see this, and she ask how many more. I tell her 6 more. She begins to laugh.
Monroe frowned. The cylinder was large, 20 cubic feet.
"That's a hell of a lot of gas,"
Monroe said. Then he realized that Ross would have grasped at once the significance of all that propane. Monroe also knew what it meant, and he broke into a grin. Annoyed, Elliot said, "Will someone please tell us what this means?"
"It means,"
Monroe said through his laughter,
"it means things are looking up."
Buoyed by 50,000 pounds of heated air from the propane gas ring, the gleaming plastic sphere of the consortium balloon lifted off from the jungle floor and climbed swiftly into the darkening night air. The Kijani came running from the forest, the warriors brandishing spears and arrows. Pale white arrows sliced up in the fading light, but they fell short. The balloon rose steadily into the sky. At an altitude of 2,000 feet, the sphere caught an easterly wind which carried it away from the Congo forest, over the smoking Mount Mukenko and across the Zaire border, moving southeast toward Kenya and civilization. On October 1, 1979, R.B. Travis formally canceled the Blue contract, reporting that no natural source of Type 2B diamonds could be anticipated in the foreseeable future. On October 23rd, Karen Ross resigned from ERTS to work for the U.S. Geological Survey, EDC, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where no field work was possible. She has since married John Bellingham, a scientist at EDC. Peter Elliott took an indefinite leave of absence from the Berkeley Department of Zoology on October 30th. Project Amy was formally disbanded, although most of the staff accompanied Elliott and Amy to Zaire. Here, Amy's interaction with wild gorillas continues to be studied in the field. Kahiga returned to Nairobi. In 1980, he joined the National Geographic Society expedition to Botswana to study hippos. At a handsome profit, Charles Monroe sold 31 carats of blue Type 2B diamonds on the Amsterdam Bourse in late 1979. The diamonds were purchased by Intel Inc., an American micronics company. He still resides in Tangier. A Landsat 3 image acquired on January 8, 1980, showed that the eruption of Mount Mukenko had ceased. A field of lava with an average depth of 800 meters, nearly half a mile, now lay over the lost city of Zinj.
This has been a Random House Audiobooks presentation. We hope you have enjoyed this audio program. Other titles by Michael Crichton available on audio cassette from Random House are Jurassic Park, read by John Hurd, The Andromeda Strain, read by Chris Noth, and Rising Sun, read by Keith Sarabika.